I have to say that the most discussion that I've had in the last 30 years with colleagues about forensic anthropology and ancestry estimation has been this week, which serendipitously includes World Anthropology Day, which was yesterday. And some of you may have attended the webinar discussion hosted and put together by SOFA. Our webinar reached maximum capacity at 1,000 people days before the registration deadline. And this indicates to me that we are interested in continuous dialogue and that we are willing to confront race and racism in forensic anthropology. In this brief presentation, I charge that forensic anthropology is disconnected in many ways from anthropology, and that it's most evident in ancestry estimation. The other panelists will delve into more nuanced and detailed discussions of the issues that I raise. Centering race in our scholarship and practice is the only path forward for forensic anthropology to reconnect with the tenets of anthropology. For the attendees unfamiliar with the field, a forensic anthropologist is tasked with reconstructing the biological profile of an unidentified individual from the skeletal remains that are of legal significance. The first 4 listed here are largely standardized, and of these 4, ancestry estimation has been the most controversial for decades. The controversy that this webinar addresses is not new, and this has to do with the fact that this praxis is part of the racial state with deep historical roots, and therefore it is really difficult to approach and to effectuate change. So
I'm sorry, your slides aren't advancing, just so you know.
Oh, okay. Okay. In this, did you get are you looking at the slide, use of biological race, biology of race?
No, it's still on the first slide. It's in your edit view.
Huh. Thank you for pointing that out. I'm sharing, but let me try again.
Yes, now we can see use of biology of race.
Okay. All right. In this simplification of the decades-long controversy, we agree that race is a social construct, and the reality of continuous human variation means humans can't be partitioned into biologically valid units. Forensic anthropologists who insist on the continuation of ancestry estimation say that in the US, its population history, assortative mating, and racism maintain a racially stratified society, and thereby discernible biological differences exist in the crania. They stress the need for ancestry in the biological profile to identify the decedent and to bring closure to the family for justice and repatriation. In the critics' stance of naturalizing race, ancestry estimation is no different from racial typology and reifying of biological race. Forensic reports in the hands of law enforcement will perpetuate serious and negative consequences. The critics also point out the circular argument that ancestry estimation is imperative because in positively identified cases, the forensic anthropologist's estimation was correct. But there's no way of knowing this in unidentified and unresolved cases. Finally, the critics charge that forensic anthropologists are part of the problem by upholding and participating in racism. I'm unable to advance. Okay. In these recent and related articles, it's clear that the authors are having different conversations, and it's reminiscent to me of the societal level contention about racism anti-racism protests, and white supremacy. Different conversations about the same topic of ancestry estimation are due to the disconnects many forensic anthropologists have from anthropology. The paradigm shift in our discipline over a half century ago has redefined biological anthropology as a study of human biology from evolutionary and ecological perspectives, and a position that as biocultural beings, the social, economic, political, and historical factors cannot be divorced from our biology. It's a departure from physical anthropology and its preoccupations with describing and quantifying traits for categorization purposes. Because biological race was invented to serve white supremacy since the 1700s, acknowledging the unfortunate role that physical anthropologists played in racist science isn't enough. Forensic anthropological research and praxis of ancestry estimation continue the forebears' racial typology, but with 21st century tools. Abandoning racial hierarchy, but continuing racial typology doesn't absolve them of the charges. Another disconnect is forensic anthropology's proximity to biomedicine and molecular biology in its uncritical use of race. There are shared ideologies such as a naturalization of humans as subjects of inquiry, which operationalizes and justifies the scientific purpose of race. Rejecting the existence of biological race and admitting to considerable overlap in the skeletal variation between the races or groups are incongruent with assigning ancestry, which is predicting probable social race based on cranial morphological traits. This is made possible by the belief that they're neutral authorities of human biology, and we see this type of faulty logic in notorious psychologists and geneticists. Students of anthropology know that science is a cultural system that insists on its objectivity. Because a framework is built upon race, the proxies for race are not only numerous, but inconsistent in its usage, often interchangeable and rarely defined except in the minds of the practitioners. In Journal of Forensic Sciences, the flagship journal of the largest professional organization of forensic scientists, the most commonly used proxy by anthropologists is Ancestry. The adoption of different terminologies attempt to divorce the methodology from the historical baggage and the current sociopolitical use of race. But unfortunately, these proxies generate much or further confusion. Biogeographic ancestry purports to reflect the heritable component of race while integrating some bioanthropological framework, but it often connects genetics with geography, genetics with ancestry, and sometimes genetics and geography and ancestry. It just kind of depends on the user. Biological race may denote physically distinguishable groups for some, but it is not a subspecies taxon. These proxies disguise race as something that's quasi-biological, quasi-genetic, and absent presence, and muddle instead of clarify our understanding of human variation. Especially due to the feedback loop between forensic anthropologists, the public, law enforcement, and government agencies like the Office of Management and Budget, words matter, and there will always be much that is lost in translation. The final disconnect I highlight is between practitioners with divergent racial frameworks. While undergraduates who are interested in biological anthropology are diverse, the subdiscipline and its specializations, like forensic anthropology, have a leaky pipeline problem, like in other STEM fields. The majority of American forensic anthropologists identify as white, and the white gaze and the white logics of process, empiricism, and scientific imperative enable the practitioners to be interested in race without addressing racism or confronting whiteness inherent in the field. Lack of racial diversity is one of the divergent mechanisms that lead to viewing ancestry estimation from the white logics or the racial state context. For example, DiGangi and Bethard raise the possibility that ancestry estimation of a non-white skeletal remains may delay investigations due to racial bias, which was dismissed by other forensic anthropologists. Just as law enforcement shows bias in favor of missing white girls and women compared to other races, there's ample evidence of racial bias inflicted on the live and dead bodies of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. For decades, the critics have been voicing concerns that ancestry estimation is lending material support for institutional racism. And this concern is legitimate in a racial state where law enforcement, both past and present, is an instrument for maintaining racial order. Proximity to STEM and biomedicine legitimizes forensic anthropology as a science, which is further reified by board certification, the only specialization in anthropology to have one. Forensic cases are disproportionately those who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color, a consequence of institutional racism embedded in every facet of society. And the imperative of ancestry estimation is justice. However, contradictions abound in stating that significant variability within a population and considerable overlap between populations exist, and that definitions of race and its membership change over time. And at the same time, biological differences still exist between American whites and Blacks. Mental gymnastics doesn't adequately change race essentialism and reification of biological race. And the reliance on and the insistence on empiricism and statistics as a tool to support this praxis are as old as physical anthropology. In conclusion, a renewed interest in this controversy is an opportunity to reconnect with our anthropological training. It goes without saying that diversifying faculty and graduate students is imperative to have a diversified curriculum that addresses the contents of this webinar. Probably most of us belong to one or both of these professional organizations, and one has had a head start on decolonizing our subdiscipline, while the other has taken us many steps back. Decolonizing forensic anthropology means to center anthropology, not forensics, and also inclusive reading of early anti-racists such as Du Bois, Frederick Douglass, Montague Cobb, etc., who had clarity about the nature of the human condition.
All right, everyone. Sorry, I'm rolling right into the next presentation. Good afternoon. Oh, wait, yeah. Am I not allowing moderating? Sorry.
Oh, you can go right ahead, Phoebe, if you'd like. The next presentation is you. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm sorry. It's the time limit. I'm wearing two hats. So can everyone see the main screen sufficiently?
Yes, we can see your presenter view, Phoebe.
Okay, thank you. Presenter view. Oh, yeah, presenter view. Okay. So, did that work? Try this. Got it. Okay, so I put together this presentation for this webinar, Blinded by the White. I hope by the end of it that you'll be able to describe some social economic factors influencing race, self-labeling in the US, and summarize some sources of population data. So both affecting living populations and where our skeletal samples come from. So I wanted to start with a look at this statement by the Office of Management and Budget. Not to, I mean, I know many of you won't be in the US, but if you are in the US, this statement establishes part of our context for why we have an ongoing concern about race, and will have one. We use race data to, in part, create civil rights policies, but we also use it in examinations of health disparities or environmental risk, or just risk management, as I like to call it, even though sometimes that does not go well. And so we have this overarching context here in the US of looking at race outside of our professional interests. So in that context, why do forensic anthropologists collect race data? Now, really, I think it's because we like to look at other people like they're insects. That's really why. But that is our tradition. You know, our history as a field involved looking at people as organisms. And so in the most neutral sense as biological organisms. But the history is completely interwoven with the concept of biological populations, ancestry, being a biological population, and then race concept as a social construct, even though its origins weren't it was supposed to be a biological concept, but that didn't stick. So in that context of our early training, our history having that, our training derives from it. And by our, I mean our pyramidal shape of descendants for today's forensic anthropologists versus where we come from. If we check our pedigrees, we have the context of this background of training. So, and there we are, many American forensic anthropologists with an emphasis on race, coupled with our history as a field deriving from physical anthropology. But you could look at ancestry estimation and or race estimation, because we try to give both terms here in my lab. You could look at it as we are trying to repatriate people, literally trying to match the identity that the people looking for a decedent are using. And I call it a decedent focused approach. Using a decedent focused approach, I think, is a skill of anthropologists, because someone who has a 4-field or perhaps 3-field training will have the context of the emic versus the edict, the external view versus the internal view, and or vice versa. And based on that, you can ask yourself as an analyst, am I using language or terms or search terms that the decedent's family will be using? Because the goal is to return the decedent. It's not to catalog another set of data. It is not to examine a shiny bug. It's to return the decedent to the family. I mean, that return may be through the lens of only a cause of death analysis and not identification at all, but it's still focused on these remains are going back to their home. So in that context, what is the immediate context of your particular case or the environment in which you do forensic cases? So forensic anthropologists were scattered across the US and world, and depending on where you are and the dynamics of a particular case, race and population, but race especially, this concept of a social label that goes with your ancestry. It may have very little meaning in your context. I first encountered this working with Guatemalans who were searching for their disappeared. I got a really weird look when I brought up ancestry estimation, because their question did not involve people of diverse ancestry. It wasn't an issue of, is there race, is there population? They knew who they were looking for. They didn't want to waste time on questions of biological ancestry. They wanted to get right to what criteria would match that person back to their immediate family and how did they die. And as an anthropologist, as an analyst, I might want to ask that question about what is the population? How much data can I extract from that skeleton? I can want that, but what do the people I serve want? What does the family of the decedent want? And I am always trying to shape frequently trying to shape my analysis in terms of whom am I serving? You know, how am I serving them with my analysis, through my analysis of the decedent? So that gets me to this other concept, especially here in Florida, where it's not like a genocide, a large sample all at once of a described, relatively discrete population. What if the context is a part of Florida or a part of New York or a part of this nation? What's my catchment? You know, where do my cases come from? And this is an issue that I'm just giving practical information on how to get at this idea of, if you've never considered catchment, what is your catchment? So how do you arrive at it? Because you probably have one. So the very first bit of advice, and I probably should have made this slide the next slide, but I will say, if nothing else, meet your neighbors. The reason why coming in a second. But if you don't know the people that live around you or the people that use the city you're in, how do you know where your cases come from? You know, explore at a regional level. Explore small businesses. One of the biggest clues to population variation I've had are the ability of ethnic restaurants that are not chain restaurants to exist in a location, especially if they're actually run by individuals that are members of that population. Or international markets, international grocery stores, do they exist in your area? Who shops there? You go there and shop and see who shops there. These are real world examples of who are the people that you serve. And by examining the population distribution where you are, you may get a chance to see that there are real people, not statistics, living around you. And that's why I put the census information last, since Wikipedia, Google Maps. I love how they have neighborhood names and census data coupled with regions, but those are numbers. And numbers actually just contribute to my biases, because if I see a low percentage, I might think, oh, I won't see anyone from that population. So I'll be fraught with thinking, this information is not bias training. I will just put it that way. I'm not giving you tools for diminishing your bias directly. That's a mental exercise that we all have to do all the time. I'm just giving you tools to implement to get an idea of whom you're serving through your death investigations. The reason why I emphasize this, and I think of this in a curricular fashion, is those of you who are developing curricula for forensic anthropology education, consider just a unit or even a course just on finding out whom you serve, because which of us lives where, works now where we grew up. I'm sure some of us do, but I don't have that luxury. I'm exactly across the country from where I grew up. So most people, the higher the degree, and that's what this chart demonstrates from the study of internal migration. So the higher your degree in the United States and other countries, the more likely you are to live to have moved far enough away that you're in a different economic zone than where you started. And in that context, if you aren't actively studying who your neighbors are, you move to a new place and you just bring your assumptions on population variation with you, unless you study it. But without actually studying your neighbors, meeting your neighbors, there's a high probability that, well, you're working on whatever knowledge you bring in. So it's up to you to establish more knowledge. How does that happen? In real life, it happens either through experience. You know, you live long enough in your job to figure out who your neighbors are, or you can shortcut it and actually study your neighbors. One of the other very practical means that I strongly recommend is visit with your fellow colleagues in death investigation, especially the death investigators, the technicians themselves. If you cannot find time to work as a technician, develop or attempt to develop research programs that allow you to spend time with your coroners and medical examiners and their technicians and hear the narrative of autopsy. Ask them what how race is used. Ask them about examples when race was disputed on the death certificate and the context of that dispute, because it will teach you how race labels, race, not ancestry labels, are applied in your environment, in your catchment. And this is this area exactly inside the medical examiner's office. I'm medical examiner's offices here. But inside that office, that is one of the first bottlenecks on our complaints about race and ancestry and do they exist and how they vary, because it's the interface of the perceived biological variation with vital statistics, because the death investigators are completing the vital statistics. So we're getting right back to that census data collection or the data collection and the Office of Management. So in that area, more than even working with sheriff's agents, is where you want to know how labels are applied. And because it may be the medical examiner, the pathologist's usage, it may only be the death investigator's usages, and you won't know unless you spend time studying how they use language. If I had more time, I'd like to talk more about that, but gotta go. So another thing to watch out for, especially, personally growing up as a Black person, and I own that race label, just FYI. I do use race personally for me and my immediate, one of my populations. We use race actively in one of my local populations as part of identity. And in that context, I see again this concept of passing. Passing was a stronger idea when I was juvenile than now, but passing is when a dark-skinned person, a person from a dark-skinned family, has light enough skin that they can claim not to be Black. What they do claim may vary, white, Hispanic, but not to be Black, often for economic reasons, not for lack of interest in being in their family, but the chances of employment are better, and the chances of the entering society at a higher class, it improves. So passing is a variable where if you aren't aware that it's a concept, what we would see as forensic anthropologists are skulls that we might, assess and go, oh, this is this is a person of African descent. You assess the characters and see, or you do measurements and see African descent. But then you are confronted with a ID of a person with light skin and want to say, oh, it's a white person, and it's not a white person. But you're confronting your bias versus how did the person identify themselves. They may have passed as white, they may have passed. And blanqueamiento is a more intensive eugenics program to get to the same accomplishment for raising social class by increasing whiteness. So you have to have an historical perspective for your area. The other part of the historical perspective is know where the skeletal remains come from. So if they're not automatically forensic, know where they come from, know where teaching specimens come from. A lot of ours are still made in India. Know about the history of grave robbing for anatomy programs. It generates collections of skeletons. Know how mortuary practices were conducted by the people that lived in your area before, because especially in the US, where the Native Americans had to leave their dead behind. They didn't take their cemeteries with them. Know how they practiced their mortuary rituals. On top of that, know the patterns of the use of those remains, how anatomy dissections occur, the art of that, because it will tell you the forensic context and may help you get around the, do I have to assess this thing called race or ancestry or not, or is it automatically apparent? Art skulls, I didn't add trophy skulls from wars, but anatomy with a cultural context may be the shortcut to ancestry and race questions. It may not, because the death investigator, your colleague, may still ask for some way to determine biological affinity, even if there is all manner of hardware and a made in India sticker right there. They may still ask for it. So, but you remember the goal. Next to last, where are you considering what clues lead to a race or ancestry assessment? For race, it literally lies in being able to say in your summary and conclusions, there, if you have that part of your report, you can give your opinions in the summary of conclusions and opinions section. There you can combine your cultural knowledge with your biological knowledge, because that's where race labels lie, in that intersection of culture and biology. So in conclusions, please, I would recommend a decedent focus, because you're working with families. And if you have no other way to convince yourself of that, oh, that's me, talk to funeral directors. But I will end there because my time is up.
All right, thank you so much, Phoebe. The next presentation is titled Increasing Disparities, Social-Political Implications for the Use of Ancestry Estimation in the Medical Legal System, and will be presented by Jesse Goliath.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Good morning here from Hawaii. Pleasure to talk about this topic today. Megan Thomasine and I have had long discussions about this topic, and being forensic anthropologists, we are social scientists that work in a medical legal context. So understanding the social political implications of the work we do is not only needed, it's essential, and it should be part of our curriculum when we're studying to do forensic anthropology. Disclosures, the authors do not have any potential conflicts of interest, and the views expressed are those of us and do not reflect the Department of Defense or the US government. Today, I would like to really focus on these three objectives: becoming aware of the racial bias present in the medical legal system, examining those racial disparities that exist in the investigation framework, the policing, and even the collection of this criminal justice data, and ultimately understanding the negative consequences that including race, ancestry, and forensic reporting does for an unknown individual. As we're well aware, persons of color are disproportionately represented in both juvenile and criminal justice systems. Evidence for this differences exist early at the point of contact with arrest, referral to court, and even placements secured detention halls. Specifically, Black youths experience more than twice the rate of arrest than white youths nationwide. And taking that further, it also applies to adults, showing the same patterns. These are largely individuals from disadvantaged segments of the population, minority men, poorly educated, lack of work experience, substance abuse disorders. And not only that, policies in place have also led to that bias. Policies such as stop and frisk have disproportionately impacted young men of color, resulting in higher incidence of arrests. And also, there's been studies done where police officers are more likely to stop Black and Hispanic drivers for investigative reasons. There actually was a study done by Pearson et al. Looking at 100 million police stops. And they found that with that these individuals, Hispanic and Black drivers, were stopped 4 times more often than white. And there was this cloak of darkness where at night there was actually even stops between white and non-white participants. So clearly during the daytime, Hispanic and Black are more profiled. We've also seen policies in place that are exacerbating this bias and targeting individuals. The Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigration Responsibility Act of 1996 added a specific article called 287G that created the Secure Communities programs that allowed for police officers, those in law enforcement, to deport illegal criminals once they were screened in jail. And then 2006, legislation actually enabled these same officers to become deputized as Immigration and Customs Enforcement officers. They had the same functions and were able to arrest individuals who had not committed a crime but had a non-citizen status. With that, we actually saw between 2009 and 2019 large numbers of arrests of non-criminals. They had not committed any crimes, but they were considered collateral. Either they were a family member of theirs had committed a crime, or they were probably in the wrong place at the wrong time. And even though there had been policies in place to kind of tamper down or to actually screen this process, on average between 2009 and 2019, 27 out of every 100 arrests were non-criminal. And we can almost see that with that, we see that 40% of Latinos surveyed were less likely to volunteer information. So we're already seeing that these minority groups felt targeted, are being targeted, and ultimately this lack of trust in the law enforcement system. We also see that sadly with a disproportion in missing children. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children the National Center for Missing and Exploiting Children has a disproportionate amount of missing children of color. When we're looking at the total number, it's 180 individuals were missing in 2019 given the Amber Alert. There were actually Amber Alert activations for. Of that 180, 69 were Black, which is 38% of those calls. 38% of those alerts are way more than the actual population demographic of Black children in the United States. And another glaring number is 10 out of those 180 were American Indian, and 6% is definitely more than the population demographic for American Indians in the US today. And I also want to note that there's even a biracial category, which does not actually have any definition to it. So we don't even know what these what groups are breaking up these multi or biracial populations as well. So they have them put as a category, but not really defined what that is. When we take that step further, we know that there's missing children. They tend to be missing children of color. We also see a differential in the coverage of these missing cases. Missing white women more likely garner media attention than non-white participants. Zach Sommers, a sociologist, was investigating this concept and developed to coin the phrase missing white woman syndrome, where we're seeing that clearly Black children account for about 35% of missing cases. However, they were given only 7% of media coverage of missing persons. So we're not only seeing that there's targeting of minority groups, we also see that children of color are missing more, but they're also not getting the same amount of coverage. When we take that further, there was actually a study done by Van der Riet and colleagues in 2018 where they were looking at missing children data from New York between 2007 and 2010. They found that Black children are about twice as likely as other children to remain missing. So we can see that, and also more predominantly female. So Black females are more likely to never be found, and potentially that child missing is consistently higher and longer for Black than non-Black children. So the percentage of them being missing, never found, and also the duration or delay of the being found increases just based on their race. Missing person cases involving Black individuals remain unsolved 4 times as often, with greater delays in recovery. We're also seeing, we've talked about the evidence of this bias. We're also seeing that in our data sets, our insufficient criminal justice data. The NCIC, or the National Crime Information Center, has specific racial codes and categories defined that actually differ from the US Census. They include American Indian, Asian or Pacific Islander, Black, white, and unknown. And in that white category, it includes Hispanic and Latino. So in other government agencies and government bodies, Latino and Hispanic are taken out. In this, they are actually put in. And at the same time, they also have a note for people to, when they record an NCIC, records for Hispanics should be entered with the race code most closely representing the individual. That clearly is that perceived? Is that self-identified by the family? We don't know. And so that leaves this area of doubt. And anyone that doesn't fit into that group then becomes this unknown category. So when you're taking all that into effect, you see everyone that's missing in 2019 has to fall within these certain criteria, either white, Black, unknown, Asian, or Indian. And when you compare those actual numbers in 2019 to the US Census data, we can definitely see this large differences in the population density or population specific demographics to the actual missing individuals. So with white alone, there is no data available because we have it including Hispanics. In Black African-American individuals, they only make up 13% of the population, but make up 33.7% of those missing. American Indian, Alaskan Natives, 1.3% of the US population, but make up 1.71% of those missing. Specifically with Asians, we do have 2.08% missing and about 5.9%, but remember that Native Hawaiians, Pacific Islanders, all of those are lumped into that population, but are not actually given a specific breakdown, especially in Hawaii. That is a big difference when you're comparing mainland Asia or Southeast and Northeast Asian to Pacific Islanders. 2 or more races, and then Hispanics have no actual data available through the NCIC. To kind of put all that together, I had presented a case study for you today, and this is Kawan Bobby Charles. He's a 15-year-old African-American boy who was reported missing to Baldwin police on October 30th, 2020. The Baldwin PD, his family reported that he was missing. They told his family that he was probably at a football game, but they still entered his information to NCIC. No Amber Alert was issued after his family reported him because it did not meet Louisiana Amber Alert criteria. He was not abducted. So because there was not an alert criteria met, they typically have a statewide alert to media. No alert was issued. Sadly, his body was discovered on November 3rd in a sugarcane field 20 miles from his home by Iberia Parish Sheriff's Office. The Iberia Sheriff's Office didn't actually know that he was missing. His family actually had to contact them separately to make them aware, and then they began to search and find him on November 3rd. So as we're seeing here that we have this information, we have these holes and these discrepancies and these disparities taking place, and ultimately this poor Mr. Charles here is no longer with us, and we had no way of knowing. The media wasn't alerted, and if it wasn't for his family, he may not have been found. We also see these disparities in funding and misappropriation of funds. From 2003 to 2020, the annual budgets for the Border Patrol and for Immigration Customs Enforcement has increased tremendously. In those increases, we see 49.8 billion goes to Homeland Security. The Border Patrol and Immigration Customs use 25.3 billion of that, but only $667,600 is spent for supporting missing and exploited children's operations. So of all these billions of dollars being used, less than $1 million has been spent looking for support in missing and exploited children. Also, U.S. Customs and Border Patrol and Protection Border Patrol used emergency funding that was actually allocated for migrant families. The only reason we know this is the Government Accountability Office did a report, an audit on their funding, and found that instead of using this money to maintain personal hygiene, maintain the facilities for these migrant families, that money was instead used to spend for dirt bikes, canine supplies, computer equipment, and other enforcement related expenditures. So even when Congress does allocate money to these groups, that money is actually not properly tracked or is being misspent. So as I've mentioned, all of these are domino effects. We see all this happening and ultimately leading to these major issues. General mistrust of law enforcement among minority communities, underreporting of missing individuals, which leads to inaccurate and incomplete data. There are these disparities in coverage among missing persons, AKA missing white woman syndrome. And because we are seeing a lack of infrastructure, a lack of care, a lack of organization or policing of these funds, we're seeing them being spent inappropriately or not being used. But there is some good news. As of December 31st, 2020, the Missing Persons and Unidentified Remains Act was passed. It expands eligibility to apply for grants to include to update and improve data entry in CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, and in NamUs, the National Missing Unidentified Persons System, which is going to be great in terms of giving us better numbers of who's missing out there and what's actually happening. It also authorizes use of funds to cover for transportation, processing, identification, and reporting missing persons, hiring additional personnel, purchasing forensic and DNA equipment, and also adding privacy protections for samples uploaded into data to CODIS database. It's specifically not identifying markers that would lead to mixed status citizens or linking that back to undocumented individuals and family members. Also, it's going to authorize the Border Patrol and the Government Accountability Office to purchase and increase usage of 911 cellular relay beacons. So instead of having these issues with border crossers and all these large amounts of death and pulling, and pretty much we're dealing with that at the end, we want to make sure that we actually have these rescue beacons so we can find these people sooner so that they don't end up another casualty of border crossing. And then ultimately, we're adding more reporting requirements. So for NCIC, for NamUs, regarding who's missing, the number of unidentified persons cases, anthropology cases, suspected border crossing cases, and then those associations made. We're trying to actually fill in those gaps of the large gaping gaps that we have in our data entry and our data analysis. So in summary of that, racial bias is clearly present in the medical legal system, as I've mentioned. Delayed investigations, reduced resource allocation, disproportionate media coverage, and insufficient criminal justice data. Targets minority communities has led to mistrust of law enforcement underreporting. Potential consequences include this for putting race and ancestry ultimately are diminishing the chances of possible identification, and that the Missing Persons Unidentified Remains Act will be a first step to addressing these issues. So I want to thank you, and here's my references, and please feel free to contact us if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Jesse. The next presentation is titled Out with the Oids, problems with the use of racist terminology in forensic science, and will be presented by Elizabeth DiGangi.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. First, I'd like to introduce who we are as authors. Black feminist theory talks about the importance of indicating your identity because that informs the work that you choose to do and how you approach that work. So I am a cisgendered African-American woman with an intersectional identity. I have a Black mother and a white father. Alba is a queer, cisgender, Black and Hispanic woman, and Daniela is a cisgender American woman. History of classification began in earnest with the age of exploration between the 15th and 17th centuries, and the map on the right here is from the 16th century, the understanding of what the world looked like at the time. Carolus Linnaeus in his Systema Naturae divided the species Homo sapiens into subspecies based on geography. And he linked personality characteristics with geography. Essential characteristics, things like being civilized or being smart or being driven by instinct. Johann Blumenbach built on it. He was a German anatomist, a doctor, a naturalist, sometimes called the father of physical anthropology. And he was the first to use the terms that we're talking about here, the terms that end in oid, namely Caucasoid, Mongoloid, and Negroid. And so what does this suffix mean? It comes from the Greek, meaning appearance or form. In English, it's used to mean resembling or having the form or appearance of, and it's also used that same way in Spanish for our Spanish-speaking listeners today. And as a result, we see it used frequently in taxonomy or the schemata for species organization. So for example, here we have part of the phylogenetic tree for the order primates. We have the suborder Anthropoidea, which includes all monkeys, apes, and humans. And then we have the superfamilies, the Suboidea, which are the New World monkeys, the Cercopithecodea, which are the old World monkeys, and Hominoidea, which are apes, humans, and human ancestors. And because the oid terms are taxonomic, that is, they're classificatory, they fit really well in the 19th and early 20th century debates about racial origins. The fact that there were biological races was not in dispute at the time. The question was how those races came to be. And those two concepts were of monogenism and polygenism, either a single origin of the races or multiple ones. And so as a folk taxonomic system, there was an inherent hierarchy associated with the terms. And we have here on the slide the great chain of being, where organisms are organized from sort of the lowest organisms all the way up to the heavens. And the terms themselves were forced into this hierarchy, largely due to the research that was being done in the 19th and early 20th centuries in physical anthropology on human skulls in particular, looking at things such as cranial capacity to demonstrate or to attempt to demonstrate that the cranial capacity of European men was higher than everybody else's. So through the course of many debates, the biological race concept was discarded, but the terms remained in use in forensic anthropology, the oid terms specifically, through the 1990s. And continue today, as we'll see. Slowly, while forensic anthropologists were reticent, people started to acknowledge that saying race estimation was not a good idea because that reinforced the biological race concept. So while the methods didn't change and the term use didn't necessarily change, researchers started to say ancestry in an attempt to demonstrate that we are not evaluating social race. And so here on the slide, I have several well-known papers from the 1990s and 2000s where forensic anthropology is holding on to the biological race concept, even though in those papers they might say that they're not, but a careful read will make it clear that they are, and you can tell that in part from the titles of the papers. At the same time, in biological anthropology more broadly, there were a number of papers indicating the issues with the perpetuation of the biological race concept in forensic anthropology and issues surrounding race and racism in anthropology overall, although these papers don't necessarily mention the issues with the oid terms in particular. And so as authors, we are curious about the persistence of the oid terms because we continue to come across them not only in the peer-reviewed literature, but also in at least one recent edited volume, and also in laboratory protocols, especially for those of us, myself and Daniela, who work in international contexts. And so our desire is to start to quantify this persistence and better understand how different terms for race and ancestry are being used. And so to examine the use of the terms, we did a content analysis of titles and abstracts in 2 journals, in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology and the Journal of Forensic Sciences for approximately the past 10 years. And we also looked at published abstracts for the annual conferences of the American Association of Physical Anthropologists and the American Academy of Forensic Sciences for approximately the past 10 years. And so here we have our preliminary raw data. We continue to work on the analysis and an expansion of the data set. We divided articles into primary and ancillary. Primary, where ancestry was the main topic of the paper, and ancillary, where race or ancestry was mentioned, but it wasn't the main focus. Here we have the results for the primary category. We then divided the use of the terms into 2 categories, either social, which includes terms such as white, Black, Hispanic, or geographic/nationality, terms that focus on region or country such as African or Japanese. And you'll note that the social and geographic term mentions add up to more than the total number because several papers had terms fitting into both categories. So as in the use of Japanese and Black in a single paper. You'll also note that AJPA had no oid term mentions, while JFS did, the most recent in 2015, and before that, there were 3 uses in 2013. For the conferences, we only looked at whether an oid term was used in the title or the abstract. And so for AAPA, there were 14 papers where an oid term was used between 2001 and 2020. The most recent use was in 2019. And for the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, there were 47 papers divided among the sections listed on the slide. And you'll note that I have a star next to that number, and that's because 6 of those 47, the terms were used, but in the context of mentioning them as either being a problem or if the paper was talking about a case report from decades ago. The most recent use was actually this year, 2021, but it was in the context of the terms being problematic. Prior to that, the most recent use was in 2018 with 2 papers, both dealing with hair analysis. One was in the pathology biology section, the other was in the general section. And I quote in the Path Bio paper, talks about all 3 race categories of hair, and then uses the terms in the general paper, the quote, Caucasoid, Mongoloid, Negroid anthropological groups. So we can see that the terms are still popping up particularly at conferences. At AAPA, the most recent was in 2019, but not before that since 2007. As I just mentioned at AFS, we have 2 papers from 2018 in the Path Bio and general sections. And so for us, this demonstrates anthropology's role in teaching other scientists, not only that such categorization is appropriate, but that the terms themselves are appropriate ways of classifying human variation. In the peer-reviewed literature, the use of the terms appears to be in decline. However, it's clear there's no consensus on what the appropriate terminology is that should be used. Even when authors mention ancestry, ancestry as a term, they still use social racial terms such as white and Black, which doesn't reflect the intention of ancestry as a geographical term. And even terms regarding nationality can be linked with social race, which can be problematic. There's a recent paper in JFS, which I have on the slide, which talks about this issue. And so what are some ways forward from this? We think that it's important that we have to contextualize history. we have to understand history. The point of history, of studying history, is with being able to understand where you are today, right? And you can't understand how you got to the here and now without evaluating what came before. And you can't envision where you're going without understanding where you are at this moment in time. And as all of us know, this is true for our personal lives, right? If we want to grow as human beings, but it's also true for our disciplines, if we want to see the disciplines that we practice grow as well. And so it's important to acknowledge that there is an inherent symbolism to the terms. We know from our linguistic anthropology colleagues that words are imbued with meaning, right? And these words in particular, given their historic and racist context. And so it's important for us to put things such as these terms in context and understand their origins so that we can understand why they're problematic, but also so we can figure out what reconciliation with the past and proper atonement for their use might look like. And we use the term reconciliation on purpose here rather than forgiveness. Reconciliation includes an acknowledgement of accountability, And it's not a solo thing that one can do. Reconciliation involves more than one person. It's a team effort. And so this team effort should include educating our colleagues in the other forensic sciences as to why terms such as these are a problem. And that brings to mind for me a quote by the late African-American poet, Maya Angelou. "I did then what I knew how to do. Now that I know better, I do better." And so personally, I'm choosing to do better. And I hope that many of you will join me in that endeavor. Continuing with this history theme, I would like to take a moment to briefly show you the photos of 3 pioneering African-American biological anthropologists. It is Black History Month here in the United States, and so it's relevant for me to mention them and to show them to you. And I will give you a content warning. There are images of human skeletal remains in the next slide, and there's also images of people who are no longer alive. So when I was in graduate school 20 years ago, I don't remember specifically being taught about any of these scholars. And it was a long time ago. It's certainly possible that I've forgotten, right? But I do remember learning about the white scholars and the white founders of our field. And obviously, as a graduate student, to an extent, it was my responsibility to go out and learn as much as I could about my chosen discipline. But what a difference it would have made to me as a young student to see scholars in my chosen field, see these pioneers in my field who looked like me, who looked like members of my family, particularly somebody like Carolyn Bondé, who identified as multiracial, as do I, and who wrote about biracial families in the United States in the 1930s. That would have had an enormous impact on me at the time. And so for all the students who are listening, I have a little homework assignment for you all. I'd like you to ask your professors, not only your anthropology professors, but your political science professors, your math professors, your chemistry professors, your music professors, your classical and Near Eastern studies professors, that you want to see representation and diversity highlighted in what you were reading for class, not only in terms of the topics that are covered, but in terms of who the authors are. And for my colleagues, I'd like to see us working towards decolonizing our syllabi and including voices that have been frequently marginalized or diminished, not only of those who have passed away, such as the scholars who are here on the slide, but those who are still living and publishing today. And if it's not possible to include work by an anthropologist or some other relevant scholar who fits into some marginalized category, then we need to explain to our students what might be the reasons that have excluded such a person from being part of the conversation. And I'll just end my talk this afternoon with a short anecdote for all of you. Last week, I was in attendance at a large meeting of forensic anthropologists, and a suggestion was made to initiate a conversation about whether we want to start talking about the awards we have for exemplary performance, and whether we might want to start to even consider renaming some of those, because inherent in honoring someone by naming an award after them is in who gets excluded from that honor. And a comment was made with regards to this suggestion: leave our history alone. Leaving our history alone is not possible until we've done a full accounting of that history. And that includes a reckoning of the invention, perpetuation, and persistence of the oid terms in and outside of anthropology, and the erasure and or diminishment of the contributions of queer and Black and other scholars who are not white. I will not leave our history alone until a full reckoning, accounting, atonement, and reconciliation has been done. Thank you very much for your attention today. And with that, I believe we have, we're gonna take a short break just to give people a moment to get up and grab a drink of water, and we will start promptly back at 2:15. Thank you very much, everybody.
All right, the time is now 2:15 Eastern Standard Time. The next presentation is titled Confronting Admixture, an analysis of a problematic tradition in forensic anthropology, and will be presented by Teresa Wilson.
Good afternoon to everybody. I want to start out by saying I'm Teresa Wilson. I'm an assistant research professor at Louisiana State University. And my co-authors are also going to introduce themselves.
Sorry, I'm Sara Mire from UND.
I'm Bridget Cone from East Carolina University.
Thank you. All right, so I'd like to start off by acknowledging a disclaimer that this presentation shows examples of overtly racist language. Their usage is intended to show the historical context of this topic. All right, let's get started. There's been much discussion recently over what may be causing the lack of diversity within forensic anthropology, with some arguing that the culture of forensic anthropology and the academy are hostile and unwelcoming spaces, and others pointing to specific concepts and language that we use in our field that alienate and denigrate those from diverse backgrounds. While the former is certainly an important and actionable problem, we want to highlight some of the issues that persist regarding language and assumptions around that language. The history of the term admixture has to necessarily start with the personal connections that we, the authors of this presentation, have with this term. My co-authors and I have spent our entire lives in a racially ambiguous space. I live in a world where I'm simultaneously Native and white, and yet never really either of these categories. My co-authors are simultaneously and yet never Hispanic and white and Asian and white. We are each the definition of what a forensic anthropologist would call an admixture. There's been a recent rise in admixture research within forensic anthropology, which likely stems from a renewed focus on the complexity of our global world and the populations that have long been neglected by the traditional three-group model of ancestry estimation. This term is often used to explain away any discrepancies and shortcomings in the popular ancestry estimation methods, or to discuss how certain populations were changed by colonization, migration, and genocide. This presentation is a critical review of the history and usage of the term admixture, with an emphasis on how this and other racially charged terms harm forensic anthropology.
So starting with the definition of the term admixture, its etymology derives from the Latin prefix ad, meaning addition, or the Latin word ad alter air, meaning to alter, and Latin mixtura, meaning mixture. Making this conjunctive word mean to add or alter a mixture, Merriam-Webster notes that an admixture means to add the term mixture, the suggestion of the alien character of one or more of the constituent elements. And the Cambridge Dictionary also provides a baseline definition as something is added to something else. Admixture has a long history in the physical sciences dating back to the 1700s. Many of these references are to the contamination and adulteration of materials and species related to chemistry, biology, and geology, with B.S. Barton's article highlighting the popular usage of admixture by saying that new plants are constantly creating from the admixture a union of two distinct species, either of the same or different genus. And so moving into the period around the American Civil War, it was only 57 years later in 1850 that the book Doctrine of the Unity of the Human Race Examined in the Principles of Science was published by Thomas Smith. The term admixture is used several times throughout this text, including the excerpt stating, in regard to the admixture of a superior with an inferior race in America, which in almost every case results in degradation and crime, it should be discountenanced by every lover of virtue. So this and other texts of the time highlight the usage of the term admixture in pre-American Civil War rhetoric. These types of publications still continued long after the American Civil War ended in 1865, with an example from John Ben Every's book on white supremacy that was published in 1868 with quotes like, the nation would in time slough off mulattoism and finally recover from the foul and horrible contamination of admixture. So in the United States, we see how admixture became a popular way of discussing and advancing racial superiority and concerns over how admixtures of races would result in negative consequences for our nation. So later on, with the development of physical anthropology, early founders like Alice Hrdlicka and other anthropologists of the 1900s adopted the term admixture to help expound upon the racial craniometric research of the time. Because much of the early cranial measurement studies were rooted in finding biological differences between the perceived races, it makes sense that this terminology would transfer to this time. As anthropology moved into successive methodological phases, we transferred the same racialized methods and terms without thinking about their origins or implications. With the popularity of genetic research in the 1980s and 90s, anthropology looked toward genetic admixture studies to find disease correlation among population with what was popularly termed hybridization. As forensic anthropology was developing additional morphoscopic and craniometric techniques for ancestral and racial categories, those individuals that did not fit into the traditional three-group model were considered problematic, and the regular use of admixture for these people was adopted.
Of the 1,977 conference abstracts accepted between 2003 and 2020 in the Anthropology, or previously named Physical Anthropology section of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, 24% or 479 abstracts mentioned race or ancestry, and almost 2% or 37 abstracts substantially discuss admixture or reference the presumed presence or absence in a population sample. Admixture has also been adopted in other AV sections, with 4 abstracts in criminalistics, 3 in general, and 2 in odontology using admixture to address issues of race and ancestry. This graph shows the increase in AV's abstracts dealing with admixture over time. These data are mirrored in the Journal of Forensic Sciences, where an increase in the usage of admixture within published articles has increased exponentially from 17 articles between 1973 and 2005 to 27 articles between 2008 and 2019. Based on these statistics, forensic anthropologists and larger forensic science community are actively engaging in research dealing with ancestry and race. However, the field has been reticent to agree on methods, let alone adopt any standards for estimation. This has led to the continued use of outdated methodology, like the 3-group model, and terminology like admixture and forensic casework. This trend can also be seen in the wider biological anthropology discipline as well. Looking at the publications in the American Journal of Forensic Anthropology between 1917 and 2020, a small but exponential increase in admixture research is seen. The long-held teaching model for undergraduates and graduate students in forensic anthropology is to focus on the 3-group model of ancestry estimation. If the 3-group model assumes that there are ideal morphological traits or cranial dimensions that align with one of the 3 specified ancestral groups, the assumption also has to be that there are only 3 ancestral groups and that any outliers would be admixtures. These assumptions are filled with coded language that preserves the early usage of admixture to mean corrupted or contaminated and reproduces the concept of other within anthropology. To highlight the continued use of this term in forensic anthropology education, one of the most popular textbooks, Introduction to Forensic Anthropology by Stephen Byers, highlights that because of admixture, there is considerable overlap between the traits that characterize the different groups. Other foundational texts approach the concepts of admixture in our field in a similar way.
Ancestry, or race estimation, has long been held as an important aspect of biological profile and significant factor for positive identification. While attempting to be less exclusionary, and the use of admixture in the place of one of the traditional 3-group model ancestries within forensic anthropological casework could delay or inhibit positive identification. The reality is that admixture is not a standard identifier. It is not used in personal forms or records. People do not describe themselves as admixtures. People do not report loved ones as admixtures in missing persons reports. The audiences of our case reports could never understand the nuance of a term like admixture, so why do we use it? The politics of identification is structured around the disagreement between the scientific labels given by forensic anthropologists and the cultural identifiers that are specific to individuals. We believe that the critical examination of admixture highlights some of the necessary changes within forensic anthropology. In reality, admixture is just a word, and finding a new word to replace it is not the solution. We call for a complete restructuring about how we talk about race and ancestry. Only when we admit to ourselves that humans do not fit into tidy little categories can we move forward. Hiding behind pseudoscientific terms like admixture do not make us objective scientists. We must rely on our capital A anthropology to understand what has gone wrong and find our way out of this typological hole. We must investigate population-specific phenotypic expression that is grounded in an in-depth knowledge of the population history of our regions, states, and cities. There are no universal methods for ancestry estimation. It is important to acknowledge that we are not accusing anyone or calling out anyone's research. It is important to make sure that we make discussions like this about communication and understanding and not witch hunts. As late as 2018, I had used the term admixture in a forensic anthropological report and had taught the concept in my courses. I fault no one for doing the same because admixture and similarly racially coded terminology are ubiquitous in our training and education. That being said, we cannot be complacent in allowing inherently racist language to persist in our research and casework. It is dangerous to continue to think about humans as distinct races and to talk about those of us that do not fit your phenotypic ideals as crossbreeds, mutts, or admixtures. We definitely want to acknowledge all of the BIPOC and LGBTQ anthropologists that have come before us. Without you, we wouldn't be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa, Bridget, and Sara. The next presentation is titled Adulteration of Ancestry, A Time for Reform, and will be presented by Ann Ross.
I'm here. I'm just trying to share my screen now. Let's go back here. Can everybody see that?
Yes, we can, Ann.
Is it in just a slide or is it with the PowerPoint in the back?
It's with the PowerPoint in the back.
All right, so let me do that. How about now?
Excellent.
Great, thank you. So the integration of race, ethnicity, and/or ancestry within the subdiscipline of forensic anthropology has been debated for decades. This debate, either public or private, centers on not only the terms we use, how we report them, what their use means for research and antecedent identification, but on how they are used, misused with death investigations and by society at large. In the mid-1990s, there seemed to be a shift in thinking on race estimation to one focused on ancestry estimation, looking to move beyond typology. However, in 2000, Smay and Ormelagos predicted that the philosophy of using folk taxonomy of race would remain unchanged and would merely continue under a different name, in this case, ancestry. Now, some 20 years after this critique, we reflect on the shift and reevaluate the state of the discipline and its practice of ancestry estimation. And we now have substantive anthropological literature to review on this topic to fully assess the nature of the shift, where we are now, and where we are headed. The deliberations from the 1990s to 2000 began when Lieberman published survey results first presented at the AAPAs in 1987 that showed that 50% of physical anthropologists accepted and 42% rejected the race concept. This finding thus instigated the great race divide in the discipline, wherein there was a clear split over what exactly race meant and whether or not it was linked to biology. This survey and its findings spurred a series of response papers published in Social Science and Medicine. Sauer explained the two-stage role of forensic anthropology within the medical legal context that first includes developing a biological profile, and second, attempting to make an identification, keeping in mind the pre-DNA era. His major argument for including race in forensic report was presented as a pragmatic one, to narrow the field of possible individuals and generate a list of missing persons. While Sauer stated that most do not feel that human biological races exist, his rationale for estimating race was that it was a routine task for forensic anthropologists and involved assigning an individual to one of the big three: Black, white, and Asiatic, including American Indians, a practice that he felt was outside of the debate over the taxonomic classification of human biological variation. He further argued that to be of value for decedent identification, the forensic anthropologist must use everyday societal or racial categories that would likely have been applied to a missing person. He therefore recommended substituting the socially loaded word race with the less charged term of ancestry to prevent continued endorsement of the unscientific premise of race. Bruce continued the discussion on the legal implications surrounding race ancestry estimation by expanding the discourse to the organization of data, i.e. human variation. She pushed for a shift in focus from the large-scale continental or subcontinental groupings to smaller scale, such as tribe or regional population. Bruce discerned there are risks in taking any single local population as representative of a continental area. Significantly, and ahead of her time, she identified the need for increased reference populations to account for changing US demographics, such as the term Hispanic, and noted then that Cuban, Mexican, many generations Texan Hispanics cannot be considered equivalent for diagnostic purposes. This last statement is a decisive lens into the culture of forensic anthropology. Nowhere can we find any reference to Bruce's critical insight into Hispanic variation. Others have been credited for the inappropriate of using the non-biological term Hispanic decades after Bruce first published it. What does this tell us about the discipline? Why were her insights dismissed or ignored? Perhaps it is a window into the acute problems of race and sex which plague forensic anthropology. The discussion of race concept persisted in 1991 AAA meeting, which resulted in a collection of papers in a book, Race, Ethnicity, and Applied Bioanthropology, published in 1993. In the introduction to this volume, Gordon surmises that not all classification is typological and assumes a broader definition of race, wherein an applied setting, the problem defines the unit of study. Here, Gordon outlines the shift from the old morphology-focused definition of race to the new contemporary definition of breeding populations, or the unit of evolutionary change. In another paper in this volume, the statement "there is something there" made by Bruce provoked outrage by critics such as Brace, charging that it is not the role of a scientist to find that something without first considering the social implications. In 1995, Kennedy asked, how do forensic anthropologists convince their colleagues and students they are not racist? A valid question at the time, as the use of race and/or ancestry as a research tool within biological anthropology, specifically forensic anthropology, was and still is widely critiqued by other scholars in the field. In Kennedy's defense of the determination of ancestry as a critical component in the identification of human remains, it is clear that the shift to using the term ancestry over race had gained some traction. Instead of the social concept of race, Kennedy shifted to the concept of subpopulations as open genetic systems showing clinal distributions. He also emphasized the pedagogy of teaching ancestry in the form of human variation rather than a mere technological or practical training of classifying individuals into the typological three-way continental groups. In the same decade, Goodman and Ormelagas highlight the reemergence of race in biological anthropology. Specifically, they warn of an escalation of biological reductionism or the search for simple explanations for complex problems, such as using race as a shorthand for human variation. They use the Franz Casting catalog as reification of race by promoting a typological view of human variation because it reduces human variation to ideal types. They go on to criticize the defensive policy of "I am just doing my job" by pointing out that this stance is, in fact, a political one. And we cannot disagree with their statement that physical anthropology of the 1990s looks suspiciously like the physical anthropology of the 1920s and 1930s. Stemming from the previous decade, there was renewed focus on biological determinism as the idea that race was genetically inherited. With the full mapping of the human genome extending through the early 1990s to the 2000s, research in this area began to flourish, predominantly stemming from work on public health. Genetic variation was identified that correspond to continental ancestry and or self-identified race ethnicity. This work continued to influence the anthropological world despite documented decline in published research on race within human variation over time, and others arguing that race was not biological, but rather racial inequality could be embodied within racialized groups. Early in this period, Brown and Ormelagas launched an attack on racial typologists that included not only forensic anthropologists, but also population geneticists like Cavalli Sforza. Interestingly, they counter-argued that the use of categorizing individuals into racial and or geographical locations, stating, "It seems that the morphological characteristics that racialist scientists and others do find useful are determined by simple variation in very specific regions and are quite the direct results of climatic and selective pressures." Notably, yes, indeed, that is what those of us who study human biological variation are interested in, the macroevolutionary forces that model skeletal and dental variation, which has recently been shown not to be the result of a single mechanism, but rather of a complex interaction of environmental and microevolutionary forces. However, one can see why there is such opposition to the use of ancestry race from biological anthropologists. Gill states that ancestry has become socially and politically charged issue, while at the same time as race assessment and research was advancing faster and becoming more and more precise. Troubling is his explanation that races are subspecies of modern Homo sapiens, and goes on to state that there are 6 recognized geographical races all right, let me see here. Listed, some are listed up here. The characterization of human races clearly is holding on to the racial typology of the past. While this paper is not typical of other research being published at the time, it does highlight ideas that ancestry race that were popular in previous decades and illustrates the concepts, for example, admixture of traits that are still seen in current research. Furthermore, these publications cannot merely be silently dismissed by practitioners. These publications are enduring testaments to the discipline of forensic anthropology that remain in the broader canon of forensic anthropological literature and thereby require introspection and critique. The decade of the 2000s also witnessed growth in method development of ancestry estimation, as well as standardization of data collection. In light of this, renewed research on ancestry estimation in forensic anthropology amid increased critique of its use, the end of the decade saw the publication of a special issue in the AJPA titled Race Reconciled: How Biological Anthropologists View Human Variation. The issue has been based on a multidisciplinary symposium hosted at the Maxwell Museum Department of Anthropology at the University of New Mexico. In this issue, Edgar and Hunley concluded that inadequate communication and collaboration led to a lack of progress in addressing issues surrounding the race issue and contributed to conflicting communications regarding human variation to our students and to the public. To finish the decade, in 2010, Larson's edited volume, A Companion to Biological Anthropologists, Anthropology, was published. In this volume, Kasperi points out that the race concept is not dead, as it is often still conflated with geographic variation, which is resistance to eradication due in part to lack of critical thinking. He also argued that because of racial thinking, population variation studies affirm the race concept by using taxonomic assumptions that are hierarchical or phylogenetic models. Here lies the crux of the misconceptions. A basic premise of numerical taxonomy is the rigid demarcation between phylogenetic, cladonistic evolutionary branching, speculation from a numerical taxonomic procedure of overall similarity or phonetics of organisms. In the same volume, Ubelacher discusses issues in forensic anthropology concerning the race concept. He cautioned practitioners to recognize the social scope and public opinion of race and to communicate results appropriately when estimating ancestry. He also challenged the use of the term Hispanic and recommended that practitioners could address this issue and others through adequate description and wording in reports. In the last decade, there has been a merger of genetic and phenotypic work on the study of modern human variation, in a sense, a modern synthesis of these two approaches to such research serving to legitimize the concept of biological races, as race could be confirmed both genetically and phenotypically, entrenching the concept in biology. Such an approach that we argue here is an adulteration of race, more specifically as part of the ancestry estimation in forensic anthropology. During this period in forensic anthropology, there has been broad acceptance of the practice of ancestry estimation with little critical reflection. As this genetic ancestry research quantifies genetic variation in association with ancestry categories, authors have claimed to be able to quantify percentages of ancestral contributions to populations. This approach has been implemented in forensic anthropology to evaluate differential contributions of parent populations to estimate ancestry, in essence, attempting to evaluate admixture using the skeletal phenotype. Again, the use of the term admixture can be misleading, as its implications is that there are populations that are not admixed, in essence, pure. This type of approach employed in both genetics and forensic anthropology can lead to confusion among the public as to the existence of biological races. In fact, has been evidence that white nationalist groups have used this genetic and biological anthropological research to legitimize their racist agendas. Future research on modern human variation needs to distance itself from racialized terminology and typological approaches. Reference samples should be regionally meaningful and with a focus on populations and not racist terminology. It is important to complicate the relationship of continental groups, and to move beyond their use. Terms must also be carefully chosen as not to evoke a racist past or embolden white nationalists. This involves moving away from the terms such as pure, interbreeding, and admixed. We suggest new terminology that could shift to population affinity and move past the inaccurate terms of ancestry, race, and ethnicity. The use of this term could be more in line with statistical models and procedures. Population is defined as a group that shares some commonality. The identification of populations would need to be based on the research question in addition to being regionally meaningful in a way that allowed for self-identification as much as possible and did not erase personal lived experiences. The use of affinity indicates a relationship or similarity that is beyond racial typology. This terminology is flexible to accommodate various research programs and allows for regional definitions and approaches. It further moves away from racial typology and allows populations being studied to have a voice in how they are classified. Moreover, researchers should strive to define the terms that they use to avoid ambiguity. Such terms are rarely defined in forensic anthropological literature, yet it is important for clarity and to attempt to deter misuse that they are. Future research approaches should incorporate population history, evolutionary theory, robust statistical methods, and non-racially motivated hypotheses. Research should be hypothesis-driven and not typologically driven. For example, research questions should focus on understanding human variation and population histories. They should not be post hoc in nature with a singular goal of typologically differentiating social race groups. Such an approach serves to reinforce a biological link to social race. Instead, research questions should focus on why differences exist and not merely that they do exist. For example, if we take shovel-shaped incisors, a typological approach would analyze the trait frequency in various populations to make statements about the ability of the trait to successfully identify an individual of a defined population, ancestral, racial group. A research-driven approach would seek to understand why differences in various populations emerged. Perhaps this could involve a micro-regional approach across various populations within a single region, or a temporal approach to understand the change in trait frequency along with changes in diet, climate, and migration. Such research would serve to elucidate why traits are in higher frequencies in certain populations and allow for a robust, yes?
Sorry, you cut, we have to move on to the next presentation.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, thank you. All right, so the next presentation is titled The Accuracy of Forensic Anthropological Ancestry Estimation in Modern Casework. The evaluation of forensic anthropology reports from 3 medical examiners' offices in the US and will be presented by Hillary Parsons.
Okay, thank you very much. Can everybody see my screen? Okay, can everybody see my screen?
Yes, we can see it.
All right, thank you so much. All right, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. This presentation is a small portion of my dissertation research and is going to speak generally on topics of ancestry estimation within forensic anthropology reports in the United States. If you want to see a broader or more detailed explanation, then please check out my upcoming article in Forensic Anthropology, similarly titled. So I'd like to begin with the goals of this presentation and note that they are threefold. First, I want to briefly describe the findings of a comprehensive secondary data analysis of ancestry estimation among forensic anthropology reports in 3 large medical examiners' offices in the United States. Second, I want to interpret these findings in the context the methods used and the limitations of the study. And third, discuss the broader implications of ancestry estimation in practice. Ancestry estimations are purported to assist investigative authorities in the identification of deceased individuals. The methods used to estimate ancestry specifically are based on the assumption that certain traits are heritable and predictable in population groups. However, heritability is not well understood, and the methods are mainly based on the observation of skeletal traits, whether they be morphoscopic or metric. The most recent debate surrounding the topic of ancestry estimation and the methods used is provided by Bethard and DiGangi and Stoll et al. Bethard and DiGangi argue that the practice should be abandoned as the methods are not scientifically sound and serve to reinforce outdated concepts of race. Stoll et al. Argue the opposite, claiming that ancestry estimation is an accurate and valuable component of the biological profile, citing previous studies by Thomas et al. In 2017 that found that the accuracy rate of approximately 90% of the FBI cases that they examined were accurate. But this debate isn't just academic acrobatics. The big picture is that there are approximately 40,000 sets of human remains that are unidentified in the United States alone. Any tool that can be used to help identify these individuals must be explored. However, it is necessary that all methods be scientifically appropriate and not just assumed to work, as inaccurate results could jeopardize an identification. When it comes to making identifications, we also need to remember that there are many factors that affect whether or not a person will be identified. It's not just about the biological profile. When a person goes missing, most of the time someone will look for them. However, there are individuals that occupy the fringes of society and may not have somebody trying to find them. Ideally, a missing persons report is filed and investigative agencies can coordinate to help a search effort. Remains hopefully are discovered if it ends up being in that situation.
We can't hear you. It looks like you were frozen and now you're muted, and also we can't see your slides any longer.
Oh, I don't know what happened there. Maybe the internet cut out?
Possibly.
Okay, let's try again. Where did we leave off?
Um,
Let me get back to screen sharing. Have we seen this slide yet?
No,
We were at the factors by positive ID.
Hold on, right there?
Yeah.
Okay, so you didn't miss much, that's good. Did I finish going through these?
No.
Okay, so I'm just basically going to say that there's many factors that are affecting identifications. And if any of them falter, then an identification is potentially, that an identification could potentially be missed. All right, moving on. So it's not just scientific and logistic standards for making identifications that's important, but also evidentiary standards. The 2009 NAS report, as well as influential court cases, such as the Daubert ruling, have highlighted a need for rigorous assessment, testing, and evaluation of forensic methods. These standards require adequate sampling and validation to be deemed appropriate for the courts. Forensic anthropological techniques used today are a combination of results gleaned from scientific methods, observations, examples from casework, and of course, personal experience, much of which has not been rigorously tested. In addition to the problems associated with the expectations of evidence, the forensic anthropological community has no single standard by which to conduct ancestry estimation in practice. So in addition to having no set standard, there's little understanding of how well ancestry estimation actually works in practice. Validation studies are valuable in that they're able to evaluate a particular method on a subset of individuals from skeletal collections. However, there exists little data on the accuracy of methods in practice. One study that I mentioned earlier, the Thomas et al. 2017 study, evaluated 99 cases from the FBI laboratory and found that ancestry estimation was accurate when compared to antemortem reports of race in 90.9% of cases, which is an impressive finding. But what does that mean? Does it mean our methods are accurate? To help address the gaps in our understanding of the methods as applied to casework, this study not only evaluates the accuracy of ancestry estimation as compared to reported race of decedents, but it also looks at unidentified cases to see if there are any trends. So I'm going to start with a couple of terms just so that we're clear on why this terminology is being used. And I'll note that a lot of times these terms are often confused or inappropriately used and often used interchangeably. But for the purpose of this study, ancestry refers to the biological or genetic makeup of individuals that can be used to trace geographic or continental origins. It is assumed that individuals cluster into broad geographical groups because of shared genetic history and environment, and therefore possess similar traits or characteristics. Forensic anthropologists often use the terms European, African, and Asian, for example, to describe ancestry. Race, however, is defined as a socially constructed classification system primarily based on visual physical features. This is what is usually filled out on missing persons report forms and may include terms such as Black, white, or Hispanic, for example. Admixture is a colloquial and imprecise term used to describe the blending or mixture of biological characteristics from two or more ancestral groups. This term is fluid and imprecise, but for forensic anthropologists, it describes assumed gene flow between population groups believed to affect physical characteristics. Terminology such as black-white admixture is often used by anthropologists to describe individuals with biological characteristics consistent with the two groups. Unfortunately, there is no definitive guide to terminology. They change over time and are often used interchangeably, which leads to confusion. Again, I want to emphasize that these terms are defined for the study by the way in which they are commonly used by practicing forensic anthropologists. So the sample locations for this study were the New York City Office for the Chief Medical Examiner, the Harris County Institute of Forensic Science in Houston, Texas, and the Pima County Office for Medical Examiner in Tucson, Arizona. These offices were chosen based on their large caseload and employment of full-time anthropologists within the office. The data for the study were derived from case reports written between 2005 and 2014. Two data sets were maintained, one for resolved and one for unresolved cases. Overall, there were 204 resolved cases and 280 unresolved cases analyzed for the analysis, and ancestry estimation was performed in these cases. Antemortem racial information was known in the resolved cases and derived from a variety of sources, including missing persons reports, police reports, and sometimes ID media associated with remains or the death certificate. Unfortunately, antemortem racial information is not known for unresolved cases. Resolved cases were evaluated through direct comparison of the antemortem and postmortem information of each individual. Correct and incorrect estimations were tallied, counted, and converted to percentages for data dissemination. Ancestry estimations were considered accurate or correct when they were found consistent with the reported racial category of the decedent. Please note these examples are a bit nuanced when it comes to the categories of Asian, Hispanic, Southwest Hispanic, for example, as several of the same skeletal characteristics have been attributed to these groups as they share deep population history. Here we recognize that some of these terms are problematic. However, the study examined the actual casework and the terms to describe the remains. Of special note, estimations were also considered accurate when ancestry estimation included multiple ancestries or admixed ancestry. Although not precise, the metric was appropriate for the research. But our methods are not sensitive enough to determine ancestry exactly. Terms such as admixed and mixed ancestry were often reported. Since this type of reporting does not unintentionally exclude a person from a match, it was considered accurate for the purposes of identification. Between the three offices, an accuracy rate of 99% was found. Accuracy does not mean precision, and these results reflect instances where anthropologists listed the individual as belonging to two or more ancestral groups or as admixed. In 7% of the cases, ambiguous terms were used when presented with conflicting results between the visual examination of remains and or the metric analyses. Among unresolved cases in New York City and in Harris County, the majority were estimated to have European ancestry, and most of the individuals characterized with ambiguous terminology were from Pima County. This likely reflects the unique population demographics of these regions, and the majority of the admixed cases in Pima County included terminology such as admixed Native American and European, likely hinting at a probable Hispanic individual. Interestingly, 44% of the cases use ambiguous terminology to describe ancestry. Now compare that to the 7% among the resolved cases. These examples on the screen are some of the ancestry estimations found among the 3 offices. In all, a large number of individuals were described using ambiguous terminology, and they seem to occupy non-white or non-Black groups. You can see up there Caucasian or Southwest Hispanic, Southwest Indian and Hispanic, admixed Native American. And so just a variety of terms to try to describe, it looks like people, non-white people and non-Black people as well. First, for our discussion, I want to address the resolved casework. The high rate of accuracy observed within the limitations of the current study is an impressive finding, no doubt, especially considering the difficulties associated with ancestry outlined thus far today. However, we need to interpret the results cautiously. This research demonstrates a level of success for only individuals analyzed among the resolved casework in specific medical examiners' offices. The casework representative is not reflective of rural locations or work conducted by part-time freelance consultant anthropologists or university professors and students. These 3 offices employ multiple anthropologists, allowing for a formal peer review or at minimum an informal review. To conclude that ancestry estimation methods were found accurate among resolved cases analyzed in this study, that they are therefore likely accurate for all casework, succumbs to the fallacy of hasty generalization. Stull et al. Commit this fallacy in their critique of Bethard and DiGangi by citing the accuracy of ancestry estimation discovered in the Thomas et al. 2017 study. Second, the anthropologist has to reconcile conflicting information on their own and make decisions based on their education, training, access to resources, peer review, and ability to interpret findings. This presents a problem when it comes to evidentiary standards, as the work then becomes subjective. Additionally, other elements of the biological profile depend on the accurate assessment of ancestry. If the ancestry estimation is wrong or unclear, other elements of the profile may be affected. So, describing individuals as admixed or belonging to 2 or more ancestries is not supported by scientific research. This strategy, however, was regularly utilized in all 3 offices, demonstrating terminology such as Black-white admixture or white or Hispanic to describe remains. Given that the heredity of various traits identified within our methods is not well understood, and because these traits may not predict how an individual identified in life, describing remains as admixed helps safeguard the accuracy of the estimation. This approach ensures accuracy, although it does so at the expense of scientific precision. Utilizing the term admixture or explaining the individual belongs to multiple ancestral groups can be interpreted as uncertainty or hedging bets. Forensic anthropology as a discipline should decide the efficacy of this approach in lieu of the expectations imposed by Daubert in the NAS report. This is especially important given that none of the antemortem data in the sample described any individual as being racially admixed. While this does not mean that the individual is not racially admixed, it does mean that these individuals were not reported as racially admixed. And there are structural issues to that as well, including there's not a portion of the report form that includes that terminology. So to conclude, we do have a resolved caseload of 99% accuracy. Ambiguous terminology is used, and mostly for non-white and non-Black individuals, and the accuracy should not be used, or the study should not be used to show accuracy in our methods. A further consideration that I wanted to point out was contextual bias. This study, unfortunately, was not able to look at contextual bias, and it's unsure how much is actually presented in this research. Although anthropologists may try to resist outside information about the decedent in order to reduce biases, in the reality of casework, particularly if the identity is suspected or the deposition location garners clues to the identity, it may preclude complete isolation of details about the cases. This may serve to unintentionally bias the outcome of the ancestry estimation. Comparatively, it is unknown how much contextual information is presented to the anthropologists about the unresolved cases. This topic should be researched among active casework to help unpack the amount and type of bias that exists. It's not to say that this level of information is negative or detrimental, since the goal is to identify people. Rather, does this information tend to be more available for those cases that are resolved, and does it And if so, does it influence the interpretation of the skeletal traits observed? This factor should be addressed. So further considerations, I would like to see some qualitative data analysis to understand decision-making when conflicting ancestry information or traits are present, and expand the study to include consultant work in smaller offices, universities, et cetera. Thank you very much for your time today, and these are my references.
Thank you, Hillary. There's
you.
going to be a short break. We're going to meet back at 3:15.
Tanya, no, now we have Dr. Watkins. Don't we?
No, we have a break until 3:15.
Okay.
Rachel's presentation is at 3:15.
Oh, break is from 3:15.
The break starts at 3:15. The break is 3:15 to 3:30.
Apologies for getting that incorrect.
That's okay. That's okay.
The next presentation is titled Racecraft in Forensic Anthropology and will be presented by Rachel Watkins.
Sorry, now I am unmuted and now I can't. I was saying thank you and that I truncated it a bit to make sure that everyone can follow, because I understand that there's some interpretation going on. So kind of following up with what Liz mentioned earlier, I always like to start out my presentations addressing my lineage. First, I'll start with my identity. I identify as colloquially as a Black woman in America. I also identify as one of the too few Black women connected to bioanthropology. In terms of my academic lineage, I tie it to the Cobb Laboratory and the intellectual and political work that comes out of the Cobb Laboratory starting in 1932. For those of you who are unaware, Cobb was the first African-American to get his doctorate in biological anthropology. And he was also a bioculturalist, very interestingly, who did not identify as a Boasian. And he spent a lot of time deconstructing racial typologies in various ways, most notably the Race and Runners article that he wrote is one that's well known to folk. His work is part of a larger suite of African descendant scholar activism, of writing and research against biological race that involved a very interdisciplinary approach, biocultural. There was always a very strong public engagement component to this work. Also, this work was informed by their positionality as racialized and gendered and other subjects who were engaged in the process of both studying and experiencing inequality. And this process was not just a matter of resistance for them, but it was also a matter of thriving and being creative and living outside of mere opposition, resistance, and agency. And I like to talk about this as it relates to the very sophisticated intellectual process of having to theorize yourself into humanity on a daily basis. Even more broadly, this is tied to what is referred to by folk like Robin D.G. Kelley as Black radical imaginaries of freedom, seeing one's humanity outside of that which is conscripted by way of Western science and by other means. And this radical imagining involves reimagining humanity, And it also involves, by way of these intellectual traditions, considerations around reimagining science and reimagining scientific expertise. And so part of what I'm going to talk about today is the way that Black feminist critiques of science and Black feminist critiques of how we construct biocultural interrelationships fits into that. Why is that important? It's important because it's among the vast amount of scholarship that has, as we say, been out there. You know, this is work that if we were to have considered it earlier, would likely have us farther along on this journey where we are interrogating these ideas around race and ancestry. And so I want to speak to briefly how it fits into this discussion. To kind of put it plainly, it's largely about bringing together topics that are typically treated or addressed separately, right? And this is because a large part of the scientific critique in which Black feminist scholars are engaged and involved brings together, kind of collapses or destabilizes this boundary between the realms of the scientific and non-scientific. And the first one I want to mention, which is in the title of my talk, is this notion of racecraft. Karen Fields would refer to all of these various ways of constructing ancestry, the reality of ancestry versus the reality of race, the ways in which my colleagues have talked about how they're very much so one and the same, the contradictions, the complexities around all of that. Fields would refer to as racecraft. And as defined, racecraft is about placing what she refers to as pre-scientific or non-scientific modes of thought into the realm of the objective, right? Making scientific knowledge from these pre-scientific or non-scientific elements to make race appear real. Another, her formal term for that is invisible ontologies, right? So, you know, using the body, using flesh, creating visual props for this ideological notion of biological race. Another piece of scholarship that I typically draw on is Sylvia Wynter and her notion of biocentricity, which involves, she talks about biocentricity being based on this kind of fundamental overrepresentation of ideal humanity as a white, cisgendered, heterosexual, able-bodied, right, fully engaged as a consumer ideal human type. And in creating the distance from that ideal humanity, creating the racial distance, the racially ordered distance that places, for instance, Blacks and folks who are on various gendered, sexual, what have you, margins, as separate from this notion of humanity, it involves creating this ontogenic reality, very similar to what Karen Fields talks about, which she refers to as making the sociogenic, making this socially constructed notion of race, right, seem ontogenic.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back from our break. Our discussant today is Agustin Fuentes. Agustin Fuentes is a professor of anthropology at Princeton University. He received his bachelor's in zoology and anthropology and his MA and PhD in anthropology from UC Berkeley. His current explorations include the roles of creativity, belief, and variation in human evolution, multi-species anthropology, evolutionary theory, and the structures of race and racism. Recent work includes leading the committee that composed the 2019 American Association of Physical Anthropologists Statement on Race and Racism, analyses of the patterns of context of diversity in biological anthropology and across the social sciences, and pushing against the misuse of science by fellow academics, the medical field, and prominent public figures to promulgate racist ideologies and related lies regarding human evolution, biology, and diversity. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, everyone. Let me make sure I can share this effectively. Can everyone see the screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Great. Well, I want to thank the organizers profusely for putting together this just fantastic symposium. And I want to thank all of the presenters for really just bringing it and providing us with a lot to think about and for really investing in this. And thank you to everyone who's attending for participating in this and in the discussion that will follow. What I want to do here is set the stage for my comments on each of the presentations and sort of bring this thing full circle so that the discussion focuses on a context of moving forward. It is very clear in the United States today that racism, we've been talking a lot about race and ancestry, and we've heard those terms, but racism is a central factor and facet of daily life here in the United States, where we're talking about this. This impact of racism has significant violent outcomes in many ways on bodies, on lives, and on the structure of our society. And it's not just that racism, right, is this sort of thing that emerges from the historical past, but in fact, racism is maintained. Systemic racism is maintained through governmental and societal structures and a number of different kinds of contexts. And we've actually been skirting around that issue and directly engaging with that issue in this talk. I just wanted to frame this at the beginning to say that we've been talking about race and ancestry and the other ways of thinking about it, but racism is really a central theme that we need to think about. And because racism, systemic racism, is so pervasive in many areas, but we're talking about specifically the United States in this context, we also need to recognize that anti-racism, right, is a particularly important contemporary academic and scientific engagement. Anti-racism, in the broadest sense, is expressing anti-racist ideas and taking anti-racist actions. Anti-racism is essential, as its central thesis, takes that racism is a ubiquitous and pervasive suite of systemic processes. This is a deeply data-based assessment. That is, this is supported. This is not a political assertion, even though it can have important political impacts. The fact that racism is a ubiquitous and pervasive suite of systemic processes is well documented and clear. So anti-racism is sort of the countering of it, involves identifying, removing, and remediating racist policies, actions, and structures. Anti-racism is an important theoretical context for academic and professional practice. It has important places in pedagogy. It has important places in theory and practice within the academy. It's got extremely important contributions when we think of a broader structural context. And it really is central in the pursuit and promotion of justice. So anti-racism, because of the reality, the well-documented and understood realities of racism, anti-racism is a central component. I bring all this to set us up for what we're talking about and have been talking about all day: race, ancestry, and racism in forensic science. Now, race and ancestry, as we've heard again and again and again, are terms that are central to much of the forensic sciences, and importantly so. However, I think many of the panelists today clearly illustrated the fact that most, even those who use it, most researchers and practitioners actually are using erroneous, violently harmful modes of these terms, race and ancestry. So I think in many cases, particularly in the forensic sciences, and I would say the medico-legal system writ large in the United States, the terms race and ancestry are used in deleterious, dangerous, and harmful fashions. We all know, and this is an assertion of fact, that race is different from ethnic group, is different from population, is different from ancestry in any mode of quantitative or qualitative assessment. Now, the American Society of Forensic Sciences is geared towards promoting justice for all and integrity through forensic science, which is, I think, very important, as many of the panelists have clearly demonstrated for us. The recent president's address at the AAFS conference really heralded this notion of pursuing justice through truth in evidence. And the vision statement of the AAFS argues specifically that scientific rigor must be unbiased, and that diversity inclusion is central to obtaining an objective and unbiased framework for the forensic sciences. If that is the case, and the data are absolutely clear that a perspective that deploys race and ancestry in erroneous and harmful contexts is neither unbiased nor it is objective. And I think all of the panelists today showed how that's problematic and how we need to be specifically engaged in anti-racist activity within our engagement, not just with the forensic sciences, but writ large, but here we're talking about the forensic sciences. We need to be engaged in anti-racist activity, processes, teaching, and research to, in fact, make the practice of forensic sciences as unbiased as possible. If one uses the classifications of race or ancestry when talking about human variation, one must be clear why and how they're using these categories. That's just simple good science and good scientific practice. They must be accurate in representing the issues of causality that they're bringing to bear, the realities and falsehoods regarding biological groupings in humans. Race is a concept that is fraught with a range of problems, and racism is a social reality that we know affects biology. So racism has no place in academic or any form of research endeavor. This entire debate has long been prominent in the forensic sciences, and here I just highlight two recent publications by one of our presenters here and colleagues that point out that this debate, this discourse, absolutely needs to be a central component of the conversation in the forensic sciences, in, of course, the human biological sciences writ large, but the forensic sciences, because of their central role in the medical legal practice and their reinforcement of racialized conceptualizations, this conversation has to be had. And in fact, that's what this symposium is. And that's why the organizers and all the panelists are really to be congratulated for doing such an exemplary and powerful job of pushing this conversation forward, of making us think with, about, and for the sort of anti-racist context of good science in forensic analyses. What I'd like to do is just highlight, there was so much in every one of these presentations. I want to pull a few things out to offer you my perspective on specific elements that aid us in building an anti-racist toolkit for forensic analysis, but for the broader understanding of human biological variation, human biology, and particularly as it relates to the intent and structure that forensic scientists seek to deploy. Helen Cho really, I think, a number of incredibly important points, but I want to sort of just highlight that central theme that proxies for race do not work. They just try to obfuscate or recreate the problems or cover the problems of the concept of race. She said these proxies disguise race as something that's quasi-biological, quasi-genetic, and absent presence and muddle instead of clarifying our understanding. So when individuals use ancestry, ethnicity, geography, continental type, what have you, rather than saying what they actually mean, we get this sort of disambulation, this obfuscation of, I think, critical realities, and calling people out for their terms and why and how they're using them. So I think that's incredibly important, and we need to stay on top of that. So we need to challenge, not just in the forensic sciences, but in this case, particularly with an eye towards the forensic sciences, when someone uses a term, that term must be clear, it must be defined, and they must justify their usage of those terms. Phoebe Stubblefield really encouraged, pleaded with all of us to take a decedent-focused approach, because the goal of a biological profile development, as she says, is really her motive, this notion of repatriation of the decedent, right? And if that is our goal, right, if that is the interest of the forensic scientist engaged in this analysis, then understanding where that decedent is, right, contextually, what that population is becomes the central component. So Stubblefield argues that forensic anthropologists might be good at this sort of biological affiliation of decedents, or what have you, however we want to characterize that, in areas where race identification is not dynamic and where populations are not underrepresented. But in many areas today, one must become completely and significantly aware of the complexity of identifications, of self-IDs, of cultural diversity, of the dynamic, malleable processes of identification, and know that for many, this simple definition by skin color or by a governmentally designated classification is insufficient to really to a decedent-focused approach. Stubblefield tells us to put ourselves in this kind of context that thinks about what labels are being placed upon the targets of the research. And finally, that reminds us that local history and cultural processes are central, and that we must understand the benefit to the decedent's family, not just sort of a scientific puzzle or riddle to be solved in the forensic endeavor. Goliath and Cosgrove Hernandez really point out something that I started with, and that is that there is bias in the medical legal system, and it's racist bias. And it's well documented, and Goliath and Cosgrove Hernandez do a good job of sort of laying it out, and they use, and I want to highlight, the FBI category system, which is slightly different from the federal government's census definitions, but actually similarly the same. And it highlights a particularly critically important area of bias, of racist bias. If you will notice, the definitions for the different types or groups of people, which is constrained and really reductive, but still has a particular kind of racist bias, because everyone who's American, Indian, or Alaska Native, Asian, or Pacific Islander, white, including Hispanic, Latino, gets to be original peoples, and yet, as is in the Census Bureau, those individuals classified as Black are racial groups. So a biologically biased terminology is used for one of these clusters, those individuals classified as Black, where the others get to be original peoples. This is an incredibly overt racial bias that's discriminatory and reflects a kind of deep systemic racism in our society. Goliath and Cosgrove Hernandez go on to lay out some of the consequences of this bias, and say that the forensic scientists in their endeavors have to be aware of the context of their work, the context of what they're drawing from, and the context of what they're contributing to. I think that's incredibly important information. DiGangi, Craig, and Santamaria Vargas also really tell us to think about the meaning, intent, and content of terms in not just in the sense of what we're researching, but in the individual researchers themselves. How do we identify ourselves? How do we identify with others? And they took on this whole notion of this pervasive nature of the oid terms, which many people try to deny, but it's still out there. And they make it very clearly that simply saying Black or white as a kind of biological proxy for ancestry, for race, for some kind of affiliation is insufficient in this forensic context, because it does not reflect the dynamics of what we're actually seeing. Words are imbued with meaning, right? And words in cases of this large systemic process of creation of categories are extremely important. And I think the most important for me take home from this presentation was that we cannot leave history alone. Representation and diversity have to be part of our shared narratives, and history is constantly being rewritten and hopefully improved. And so one of our jobs in an anti-racist format is to tell histories that have been covered, that have been excluded, and that have been obfuscated because they're central to our ability to do better. Wilson, Mire, and Cone really put another term on the table, and that is admixture. Admixture, whether it's in forensic sciences, human biology, paleoanthropology, is a bad term because it assumes an essentialist notion of races, of reality, of biological races as distinct evolutionary lineages. Admixture is problematic, but it is ubiquitous. You can see it in literatures across the board, and you can see it as really characteristic of the thinking of many forensic scientists, many human biologists, and many paleoanthropologists who really think there are these different things that are in the human realm, whether they be Neanderthal peoples and humans of that past a couple 100,000 years ago, or whether they be the white, black, Asian, oid categories of today. It is dangerous to continue to think about humans as distinct races because of the violence. And I love this final comment that they made. We are not crossbreeds, mutts, or admixtures. Those are incorrect scientific and violently harmful structural modes that promote a kind of systemic racist belief system. Ross and Palud, tell us that that really this big three, as I've said now in many of these, the big three is still accepted, right? Black, white, Asian, Africa, Europe, Asia. These are not biological groupings by any measure in any context, and yet they are still maintained. And people try to swap ancestry for these categories, and that is just not allowable. And I think this quote from Alice Bruce is really important. We get to think, again, back to what Stubblefield told us, local populations are really important, but they do not represent continental areas or large giant divisions of humanity. And affinity might be a way at it. And I think that's something to think with, but it's quite complicated. Parsons, I think, really importantly showed us that we can show high statistical success in some categorizations, but that is just a teeny part of the overall context. And in fact, to conclude that ancestry estimation methods work because of a high level of accuracy in resolved cases, as many have shown, ignores all the complexity of the unresolved cases. And finally, Rachel Watkins really points out racecraft as a central component in our thinking, in the way we have to understand that the scientific imaginaries perpetuate this biological myth, that non-scientific modes of thought are merged with objective scientific knowledge when we think about how forensic science is actually developed and implemented. And finally, Watkins reminds us it doesn't have to be this way. We can reconstruct the process, and we are trying to do that now. And that is the critical anti-racist work that we need to do, not to be blinded by the white. So our panelists have shown us that anti-racism is in fact possible in all of these ways, and especially it must be central to an effective forensic science. Anti-racism is an important intellectual and a practical endeavor that pushes back, as we've seen from all of these panelists, at erroneous, deleterious, and violently harmful assertions about human biology, human history, and human realities that we know act to maintain systemic racism. We can push against them. We can be part of the problem. We can be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. I want to thank all of the panelists for really getting everyone to think with this very important topic and to push us a little bit further on not being blinded by the white, because we are undertaking and trying to commit to an anti-racist pedagogy, theory, and practice. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Okay, so Tanya and I, if all of the panelists, you're welcome to share your video and your audio. We're going to begin the Q&A session. So if you had questions, You can still put them in the Q&A section so that we can answer them. But we'll go ahead and start with this question that seems to be addressed to all of the panelists. How can POC students address these issues to their superiors without fear of consequence? I have addressed a professor multiple times about the use of oid terminologies. I was just seen as problematic and loud, and I was dismissed. How can we address issues of race as students?
Who wants to take that one? That's a hard one. Maybe Agustin, do you want to try?
I mean, how can we address these issues of race as students? So as a student, you participate, you engage, you learn, right? And you find allies and friends and peers who are ready to engage in this discussion. But it is not your responsibility to change the world. It is your responsibility to learn, your responsibility to get together, to collaborate with others, but it is the faculty's responsibility. It is those with the power, the responsibility to take ownership of this, and you can help them. The students help us learn about teaching and help us learn about sort of conveying meaning and understanding. So help your faculty, help those you are working with, or if you're in the professional workplace, help your coworkers sort of engage with this. But it's not wholly your responsibility to change the world. It's your responsibility to work as you best can, but also to learn, right? And to not expect that all the responsibility is on your shoulders. Those with power need to step up.
Yeah, to kind of add to what Agustin said, trying to find allies, not necessarily in your department, not necessarily in your college. You have an institution of faculty across subfields, across interests, across departments. There are people who are there who can help you, who can be mentors, who can be faculty advisors. So you can actually make yourself, you can have your own track, your own academic learning path as well. And so seeking out those allies can help as well. So not necessarily, I know it's going to be hard for the power dynamic within your department, but seeking out those allies who are also full professors, associate professors, who can be your ally and could be your mentor as well.
All right, thank you, Agustin and Jesse. We had someone ask, this is kind of in relation to Phoebe's presentation. Someone asked, what kinds of conversations, research, etc. might forensic anthropologists do to ensure that an identity-focused biological profile to be submitted to law enforcement entities doesn't become coded language that leaves the racist history and assumptions in race/ancestry determinations unchanged?
So communication is a risky venture. I guess you could say that if there's an easy route, I would say start by trying to avoid loaded language to start. So in the context of race, that's going to mean that even if the death investigators still call people, well, I don't hear Negroid very often, but I've still heard Mongoloid. And if they're still in oids, you don't use them. But what I generally say is use more words to get at a geographic realm. You can use, all the words you want. You're the one writing the report, and that may help the reader, the death investigator, either interpret it because there's more words, no guarantee there, or ask you directly because you wrote so many words and now they have to use oral communication to find out what you're talking about. And that creates an opportunity to go, this person might have fill in blank a background of in the context of where your forensic catchment is, or you might find out that there are other cues that they didn't disclose to you, like cultural indicators that came with the remains. This is what usually happens when I end up in a verbal discussion, not about ancestry, but I find out the things they didn't share with me in the scene notes, or about the context of the recovery of the skeletal remains, that I go, oh, well, okay, then yes, what I wrote to you, interpret it, in this way, you know, for such and such ancestry. When that happens, I'm struggling with one of those right now, actually, and it's not going well. But use more words. The trouble is, for things like race, we're always going to be bouncing off everyone else's preconceptions. And part of the problem is that race is just a mercurial term. I mean, because I say, oh, I identify as Black, but I have no assumptions, or few, or at least ones I won't admit to you, that when I say I'm Black and what you think or hear when I say that are the same things. And I you know, and part of that is because I grew up in a large metropolitan area with other Black people who clearly had several working definitions of Blackness. And so, you know, I just own my particular one, and it can change too. So that context makes me just be a little patient of communicating about race and ancestry to death investigators. So I just keep trying to focus on, well, what language will I use that gets this person sent home and not left in a box somewhere? But I must admit, lately, a lot of the outcomes of those queries are, well, can you pull a tooth for DNA? And so the conversations are heading in that direction towards not even genealogical DNA analysis, just, you know, DNA analysis. And someone in the chat had asked about, is there a way forensic anthropologists can get out of this use of race? And technically we could just stop assessing it, take it off the biological profile. We don't have to assess it. And then the geneticists will have to, because the death investigators will still ask. I don't know a way to make death investigators stop asking, because they're closer to the interface between death and vital statistics than we are. And until we start filling out the death certificates, I don't know enough about lobbying and politics or what have you, or how you get state laws passed that we would be able to change it, you know, but that's not my world.
Yeah, and I found out that working with investigators, they want to learn, right? You can have conversations with them, and I don't use the continental approach to population affinity. I haven't used it in 20 years and I'm not going to start doing it now. But because they ask you, so what does Mesoamerican mean, right? And I was like, well, I'll have to explain it to them. They get it. They get it. And I think they just want to understand. And they also want to get the decedent identified.
Yeah, frequently. Yeah, because you met ones, you know, you meet investigators who are so passionate, it makes me, well, I don't have a lot of compassion to begin with. And I meet investigators that make me want to cry when they just start talking about
they spend their whole like, we have this one cold case and I'm retiring and I have to get it solved.
Yeah, and then
and there really are.
Yeah, some art is invested and you meet them. So it's
and they do want to talk. Yeah.
Yeah.
And right there, Anne, you're pointing out that you do things differently than the big three offices that I examined in my research, which kind of illustrates the point that there's no standard in how we're doing this. Should there be a standard?
Right.
How do we go about making these decisions for investigators who have their own objectives and own, you know, stakes
and you know, and the fact is, maybe I'm not following our indoctrinated standards, but that was my choice, and I just don't do it.
And there's nothing that says that you can't.
Exactly.
I think it's also important to highlight something, Phoebe, that you said just a moment or at the beginning there, this sort of turn by many investigators to, oh, well, the DNA will give us the sort of solid, this sort of notion that ancestry, this uncomplicated notion of genetic ancestry, which frequently is not what the DNA is telling you at all, right? It's telling you about genetic similarity to reference populations. What are your reference populations? It's not even getting you at the genealogical ancestry.
Right. And it's giving you your Neanderthal admixture, and I don't see how that is going to give you an identification.
And see, here's my 10% European ancestry elbow, unless it's this elbow. You know, sometimes I watch BuzzFeed videos. YouTube has quite a few of them, where people unmasking their genetic ancestry
yeah.
tests with a consultant, a counselor there helping them, but it just ends in a whirlwind of bewilderment over percentages, and they never go to the point where I'm going, okay, you keep shaking it and they'll settle on an identity. I want to see that. No, it doesn't happen. You know, they don't, you know.
And
I'm like, oh,
they
okay.
also misinterpret the frequencies, right? So they
Oh,
have,
it's just
you know, and it's like, okay, what was your reference population? And you have these frequencies, and they don't understand the nuances.
No, and the counselor doesn't provide meaning about that, especially well, I've only watched a handful of these, but the part where, like, I have a profile, I use 23andMe, and I crank it all the way up to 90% probability. So I can see it as vague, because that has meaning to me. That vaguest for them classification is, to me, what is if I'm going to contribute identity to DNA, it would be in that realm.
Girl, when they drag you out and they accuse you of a crime, that's on you.
It's too late. I'm in it. I'll just blame my twin. I have an identical twin. They probably won't do it, you know, because those CODIS markers aren't going to separate us.
Right. Okay, good. You got a scapegoat.
Get that.
Okay, the next question is, often during these conversations, I hear a lot of responses about how these concerns are not the job of forensic anthropologists. And the examples of biases presented in arguments like Jesse's are not examples of forensic anthropologists. These people remain unconvinced of the existence of issues in forensic anthropology. I don't think forensic anthropology can be considered in a vacuum, and it is not exempt for the stains of the history of the system it belongs to. Can Jesse and the other panelists speak to that?
Sure, I'd love to. It really, if we're big A anthropologists. I came from Notre Dame, where I was taught under Dr. Fuentes. He was one of my advisors. We're anthropologists. It's a four-field understanding of who we are as humans. If we are going to take that title as anthropologists and work within a medical legal context, we need to have the social and cultural context for the work we're doing. We're not an anthropologist then if you're not taking that into account. Cultural relativism, cultural differences, understanding what it is to be human is what forms our field. That's the foundation of our field. So if they don't understand that, then they're not really doing anthropology. I don't know what they're doing. They're probably looking at bones and doing measurements, which it is osteology. It is getting at some answer, but we're not doing forensic anthropology then.
Yeah, I mean, I think that to piggyback off of what Jesse just said, you know, this is part of the reason why I really appreciate these Black feminist critiques of science, because they go right to the heart of kind of collapsing this notion that there's some sort of scientific realm in which forensic scientists can remain relegated, and there's this unscientific realm that's for somebody else to deal with. And, you know, I think all of us did a great job of emphasizing how, you know, these issues that have historically been considered unscientific are indeed scientific. They always have been, and there's a body of scholarship to draw on. And there are plenty of people in forensic science who understand that and operate in that way.
Yeah, I would add to what Rachel and Jesse just said. Any forensic anthropologist who claims that we're not, you know, we're exempt from racism, we're exempt from bias, is living in fantasy land, to be completely frank. We are part of society the same way that everybody else is part of society, and we are influenced by, you know, racism, just the way, and bias and structural inequality and structural violence, just the way that everybody else is influenced by it. I talk about some of those issues specifically in the paper that I wrote along with my colleague, Dr. Jonathan Beathard. It just came out a couple of weeks ago, trying to point out to our forensic anthropology colleagues that absolutely this is something that influences us as well. And we think about that. And I think that, you know, one of the points I make in that paper, or John and I make in that paper, is we're really comfortable as forensic anthropologists as anthropologists overall with studying others, right? We study other people. I'm here in my lab or in my office, my lab's right behind me. I've got the skeletons of other people there that I have no problem going and opening the drawer and, oh, look at this temporal, look at this mandible. What makes us uncomfortable, all of a sudden now the spotlight, is shining bright in our face and we're like, ooh, what that I'm uncomfortable with that. No, if we're comfortable studying the skeletons of somebody else, we need to learn how to be comfortable with pointing that spotlight at ourselves as well, and really reckoning with our racist past and present as well.
Thank you. Someone asked, does anyone know or have ideas on how developing non-Western countries can be included in this conversation on reconciling terminology? China still uses Mongoloid. The Philippines still refers to themselves as racially Malay. These are terms they colonially inherited from the West and were imposed upon them by the West. Now that the West, specifically the US, is trying to reconcile their past, these former colonies are left behind with these damaging ideas.
I'll take this one. I think I face similar problems when I do research in Korea, that during World War II, before World War II, during the 30-year Japanese occupation, it seems that the racial typology, this kind of, great chain of being, that ideology was, I guess, absorbed and accepted by the occupiers, and the Korean society now still does have that kind of colonial mentality, and that does get directly reflected in the way they do forensic anthropology. So yeah, in terms of these old typologies, at least in my experience, they are nowhere near biological anthropology, and they are pretty much in physical anthropology. My attempt is just to do more of the critical analysis, but then of course, pissing off your colleagues in this area that you do research, that's a delicate balance. But yeah, it's a pretty common thing, not necessarily in just the global South, but I think other nations as well. Because obviously what we talked about today, I think is quite pertinent in American forensic anthropology. And of course, we all know that other than McDonald's, we also export this 3-race ideology.
And I think, Helen, that's exactly, I think, a good point, that export notion, because most of the major sort of forensic science journals and the sort of physical anthropology journals, not all, but most are based out of the UK and United States or Canada, some within a few other areas. Korea and China also have some, but most of them are in English, right? And so the publications and structures are heavily influenced by what we publish, what the editors and what the editorial boards enable and facilitate in these global dissemination of the knowledge. And so I think in many ways, it's on those of us within the sort of, what I would say, the hegemonic systems of the production distribution of valid scientific knowledge, to be from within radically changing those, to push against those terminologies and those structures. And that's what this panel and this symposium was about. Because the first step is not to sort of, I think, engage in this global critique, but rather an internal critique of what we're doing, especially in the world of publication and funding. I think those areas are where a lot of this change has to occur.
Yeah, and I'll just add on to that. I do and have done in the past for many years consulting work in the country of Colombia, also to a lesser extent in Mexico and Algeria. And it is really hard in those contexts when you're looking at the lab protocols of the people who you are mentoring, and there's not only the use of these terms, but there's also outdated methods. There's maybe methods that are from somebody's master's thesis that was never peer reviewed, and it can very often kind of be an uphill climb with trying to to pick and choose your battles with, okay, so we need to work on making sure that you're aging the skeleton correctly and that you know what you're doing. And so maybe things like combating the racism in the protocols, unfortunately, just kind of goes lower, lower to the bottom of the pile. And to Augustin's point, the fact that a lot of the knowledge production in forensic anthropology specifically is in English. And so in the global South, or in Latin America specifically, I know that context the best, people might only have access to things in Spanish or much older things in English that have been translated from 20 or 30 years ago, and not to the body of knowledge that is recent or even within the past 10 years. And so this is something that I've been contending with for the past 10 or 15 years of my career, and I don't yet have a good solution for that.
It's also an accessibility issue, right? They can't afford to buy all these journals or buy into these journals. So I always try to encourage colleagues to do open access as much as they can, because we can afford it, but to give them access to important work that's out there.
I mean, isn't this exactly what we were trying to do with the Academy, with the diversity and inclusion subcommittee in our section? I think that was exactly one of the goals and the spirit of the anthropology section. And for those of you who didn't follow it, it was, I guess, unceremoniously policed and I guess dissolved. Is that right? That was the word that they used. Dissolve this successful diversity inclusion committee that included mentorship that Jesse talked about, that included the kinds of monies that maybe we can provide for travel to somebody who otherwise would not have access.
I think in this context, it's also important to really emphasize the collaboration with individuals that are not from the US in this context to sort of work, because while we dominate the sort of the English hegemony of publication is a powerful, imposing force, the actual innovation in research methods and engagement is frequently coming from other areas, right? And so those collaborations and those connections, I think, can be very fruitful. But that's another kind of diversity and inclusion, right? The sort of colonial moment. No one talks about post-coloniality. No, the colony, particularly in the sciences, is still maintained fairly robustly. And I think sort of decolonizing that, like the anti-racism we were talking about, means opening up to participating with and honestly and fully collaborating with colleagues from outside of just the center. The periphery has much to give in this kind of discourse.
The next question says, playing devil's advocate, race questions are everywhere. Race questions are on surveys, applications, census data, etc. If we do away with race, then will we be doing away with diversity? If not, then how will diversity be identified without discussing race?
I think we are talking about the dangers of maintaining this myth of biological race. And I think and anthropologists will be quick to point out that races are very much real social realities, but we really have to distinguish the reality of race in lived experiences and really just continue to try to debunk this old, I guess centuries old idea that biological races are somehow something there.
It's also so important to highlight that it's racism that is the problem, right? Racism is the structuring, systemic, violent actions that changes bodies, that challenges us. And I think everyone's sort of focused on, well, do we use race or do we not use race? Oh, okay. If you're going to use race, be clear about what you're using it for and how you're using it, acknowledging the systemic racist violence in which that context occurs. That's the problem. Is we don't talk enough about racism in an intellectual academic context. And that's why anti-racism is a valid academic intellectual research tool. It is not just a perspective. It's a real thing that we need to be doing.
The next question asks, forensic science requires communication of these concepts to a wide array of communities. The public, law professionals, communities impacted by structural racism, sometimes by our own field, and finally our own self-reflexive community. My question, are we nimble and capable enough to transmit these concepts to all these communities?
When's the deadline? I ask myself that sometimes. When is the deadline? When you're dead? So yes, because you know, like how you got a bad habit, like I got a bad habit. I eat whole bricks of graham crackers, the whole thing. And it's a bad habit, let me tell you. So when do I need to fix that? Before I choke to death on graham crackers. So, you know, I get multiple attempts. So to reach out to all our communities, or to initiate any engagement, you know, any program we want, you know, just try the program. Whatever you can handle that catches your area, just try it. So like, I won't ask anybody to reach out to all of their overlapping communities. You might just start out by recognizing that you have overlapping communities, you know, especially like if you're in an academic setting where you teach and do casework and do research, and maybe you manage directly several students in that process. So that's 4 circles already that you're touching all the time, because the managed students are separate from your regular teaching. So then you say, oh, I want to reach out to the law school, or and to the medical examiner's office directly, and to no, pick one. Just reach out to one, you know, the one that's closest to you that you can manage, you know, especially if you don't have a relationship with one of those at all and it's intuitive. So you start where you can, you know, manage where you can, but start, you know, I've just found it's a good start to map out the relationships I know I have, and then see what I can affect with the resources I have. And it can be practical, it can be theoretical. You know, because one of my overarching difficulties with the discussion of race and racism, the overarching, you know, the role of anthropologists in it, because I know the history of, because it is I'm lucky to be here, history of the physical anthropology. And in distant time, because of eugenics, and proximally because of choices, because Dr. Maples chose to take a Black student, not just a student. And so I might not be here. But I look at that whole context and I go, let's just not argue so much about our practice that we forget our goal. And so I talk about the goal, and that's important to me. But I also realize that for my own field, not everybody's field, for my own field in forensic anthropology, I interact directly with families. You know, I have families call me and say, when are the remains going to be released? And they don't want an answer. Actually, they want me to listen to them talk for half an hour. So I listen to them talk. I give them my time, because that's actually why they called in the first place. And then to find out the answer. And I realized doing that what if I can't communicate with the public? And so that gets to my problem with this discussion of race and racism. I want to affect racism. I don't want to adopt race terms, or I personally don't want to argue about race terms, particular terms, except for the ones that end in OID, because that's just too dated. But I do need to be able to talk to the people I serve and have them understand what I say. And so that's, to me, that falls in the category of handle what you can. So I handle what I can in that regard. I can only handle a limited discussion of terms, but I know some of you can handle other things, and I respect that. And just start with the first one. That's just the first one, whatever that is.
Okay, the next question says, I was educated under the framework of ancestry rather than race. However, I understood how they were different, other than the former possibility being more politically correct. Dr. Ross's recommendation that we move away from ancestry to population affinity because that's less racist sounds great. But I feel a thorough explanation of what population affinity actually looks like is lacking. How does that look operationally in forensic anthropology?
That's a really good question. Actually, Marin and I, Dr. Palut and I have a paper under review right now that addresses how it looks like. So the tenets of it is that you have to look at it from an evolutionary perspective. You have to look at populations and their population histories, what things happened to this group of people. So I'm from the Republic of Panama, right? So I can tell you that in Panama, not only did we have the Spanish conquistadors come in who brought in slaves with them, then we also had the United States that bought Panama from Colombia and built, a huge canal. And they also brought in people from all over the world to help with this huge earthworks project, right? All those things shaped the demographics of Panama. So we have to go about doing our research in thoughtful ways, not because you go to a museum and you're like, hey, look, here's, European American, and then I'm just gonna pick some random group from another part of the world to try to, am I going to find differences? No, it has to be hypotheses driven. They have to have thoughtful questions, and you have to do it with an evolutionary perspective. So, for example, shovel-shaped incisors, right? If you're going with this trait list, all of our hominid ancestors have them. Orangutans and their fossil ancestors have them. And there's, regional continuity from Asian Homo erectus to modern Asian derived populations. So what actually comes out as being unique is not shovel-shaped incisors, because it's obviously not unique, because everyone has it, are the spatulate incisors that are found in European populations. So it's a framework and way of thinking. Why are we doing it this way? So for example, you've already pre-picked your groups, right? Let's go find traits and look at the frequencies between the traits. Well, instead of pre-picking your groups based on cultural factors, site material, cemetery material, why not just not know those things and see what trait actually comes out as unique? Because you've already grouping them, right? And it's an a priori grouping. And so you're just looking for differences. That's not science.
Okay, so the next question asks, a lot of research has looked at how a lot of variables play into forensic methods. How do we approach the use of craniometrics, dental morphology, dental metrics, and morphoscopic variation into research to exemplify the influence of all these variables for every method used?
Well, here we are dealing again with craniometrics. We know that if you use a numerical taxonomy approach, craniometrics can be used as a good genetic proxy. Morphoscopic traits, we don't have the data. Those traits were selected without looking at the evolutionary history of those traits. And they started in the skeletal attribution of race. And then all we have done in the last 10 years is use those traits that were picked and put in this book and tested them. But there was never any critical thinking as to why those traits were selected. So we have to start with that. We have to kind of scrap it all. And so we look at dental metrics, right? So those are pretty stable over time and among populations. And then we also have dental traits. For example, the other thing, right, that we have is the 5 cusps is common among our hominid ancestors and among most of our primate cousins. But what is unique are the 4 cusps. So we have it flipped. We didn't even bother to look at the evolutionary histories of these things. So that's one of the things that we're really kind of trying to push here, is look at the population histories, not only recent, but past population histories, to help us kind of narrow down and identify thoughtful hypotheses that can be tested.
I mean, it's also important to at least acknowledge as well, and maybe, and I'll push a little bit here, that craniomorphic traits, usually most of the craniometric traits that are used are not tied to any patterns of selection, and are mostly the result of a variety of different other sort of growth, drift, and other functions across, you know, a lot of the hominins, but particularly in contemporary human populations. And so while they're usable to classify based on certain parameters of expectations of craniometric diversity and patterns, they don't reflect necessarily any of the assumed underlying patterned differences by groups, which are not genetically reflected as well, right? And so you frequently see an association, and this is back to the oids concept, the idea that craniometric variation gets you some proxy for evolutionary lineage or genetic diversity, and it doesn't. And I think that's something that's really, really important.
Well, if you use it with a numerical taxonomic approach, you can look at past migrations and population histories. The problem is you already doing this 3-group tricontinental, right? It's populations are clinal, right? And that's the issue. And then like you stated, okay, yes. So for example, in Latin America, we had the populations coming in across the Bering Strait after populations settled. Some populations differentiated due to drift, right? They settled. Then you have colonialism, conquest, and all those things on top of that, and local adaptations that have to do with altitude, right? That does affect craniofacial morphology. And so we're not even thinking about those things, right? So we're preconceiving all of that. And in order to do it properly, we have to not have these preconceived notions. Right. We have to be able to look at these things.
Right, and this whole idea of what defining an actual population, because most of the time people will talk about populations and actually use non-comparable things that they're glossing with that term, and always fall back to the continental types, which are not populations in any stretch or any available bio term.
Not even close.
Yeah.
But I think the question and all of your comments definitely really highlight the main, I guess, tension or the divide that these are bioanthropological perspectives and the way many of us are doing our work, and then thereby criticizing what forensic anthropologists do. And then forensic anthropologists, they're coming from a very different side, that it's really pragmatism that they are after. They understand. I mean, it's not like they're not understanding the difference between the typology or description or classification. It's just that the buck stops there for many of them, because that's what they do. So they are maybe not, I can't remember who wrote this, not having the luxury of these kinds of perspectives, the evolutionary, the ecological, the population history. Somebody used that word, that they didn't have the luxury to do the bioanthro.
But is that a luxury? Is actively maintaining systemic racist structures a luxury? I mean, so I would say that the science mandates a critical engagement with these concepts, even though, and all of you have just presented, this clear thing that there are viable forensic analytics that allow you to go beyond the simplistic sort of